Have you ever struggled to understand what people are saying in English? Or maybe you've tried to improve your English but aren't seeing the results you wanted? Hey there. Welcome to the Soulful English. I'm Blake, and I'm really excited to have you here today. Let me ask you a few questions before we dive into today's episode. What if I told you that in just 30 days you could make huge progress in your listening skills? In this episode, we'll talk about how I improved my English listening in 30 days and how you can do the same by listening to real-life stories. You'll not only improve your listening, but also your writing skills. Because when you listen closely, you pick up on sentence structures, vocabulary, and how ideas flow. Let me tell you a quick story. A few years ago, I went on a trip to Spain. I was really excited to practice my Spanish, but what happened next was totally unexpected. I met a guy named Michael at a cafe, and we started chatting. At first, I couldn't understand much of what he was saying because he spoke really quickly and his accent was different. But instead of giving up, I decided to keep listening carefully. Every time I didn't understand, I asked him to slow down or explain it in a different way. Slowly but surely, I began to understand him better. One day, he told me about his experience learning English and how listening to real conversations made a huge difference for him. It hit me. That's exactly what I was missing. Just like him, I decided to focus on listening to everyday conversations instead of just studying grammar or vocabulary. Over the next few weeks, my listening improved dramatically. This experience made me realize that improving listening skills isn't about boring tapes or repeating phrases in isolation. It's about engaging with real people, hearing their stories, and practicing to active listening. It's the same for your English. So why don't we make today's episode your first step towards improving? In 30 days, you'll get the chance to practice with some real-life stories just like mine and learn how to become a better listener. And remember, at the English Pod community, we upload videos every day to help you improve your English with topics just like this one. Now, let's dive into my journey and see how these little changes led to big results in just 30 days. I want you to imagine something for a moment. Picture yourself sitting in a cafe just like I did when I was in Spain. You hear people talking all around you, but their words sound like a blur. You catch a few words here and there, but the sentences move too fast. You want to join the conversation, but you're not sure if you'll understand what they say next. Has this ever happened to you? If so, you're not alone. When I first arrived in Spain, I was excited but also nervous. I had studied Spanish for months, but when I tried to listen to real people speaking, it felt impossible. I remember ordering coffee on my first day. The waiter asked me something and I froze. My mind was racing. Was he asking if I wanted sugar, milk, or a different size? I had no idea. Instead of responding, I just smiled and nodded, hoping that whatever he asked wasn't too important. When he walked away, I felt frustrated with myself. Why was it so hard to understand spoken Spanish when I had studied the language so much? That moment made me realize that studying words and grammar alone wasn't enough. I needed to train my ears to understand natural speech. Just like a child learns their first language by listening before they start speaking. So I made a plan. For the next 30 days, I would focus completely on improving my listening. I promised myself that I wouldn't give up even when I felt confused or overwhelmed. And I'm glad I did, because what happened next changed everything. On the second day of my trip, I met a man named Michael. He was a local, and we started talking because he was curious about where I was from. At first, I struggled to understand him. His words blended together, and his accent was different from what I'd heard in Spanish classes. But instead of giving up, I decided to listen carefully. I paid attention to the rhythm of his speech, the way he connected words, and the common phrases he used. I even repeated some of his words in my head to get used to how they sounded. After a few minutes, something amazing happened. My brain started recognizing patterns. I still didn't understand every single word, but I got the general idea. Instead of panicking when I didn't understand, I asked him to repeat things or say them in a different way. He was happy to help, and our conversation kept going. That moment gave me so much confidence. I realized that listening wasn't just about knowing every word. It was about understanding the meaning behind the words. That night, I made a list of new words and phrases I had heard during our conversation. Instead of just memorizing them, I found real examples of how people use them in everyday life. I listened to short audio clips of native speakers and tried to guess the meaning of sentences before checking the translation. I also repeated sentences out loud, copying the way native speakers spoke. This helped me connect listening with speaking, which made learning much easier. By the end of the first week, I noticed a huge change. I could understand more of what people were saying without needing to translate everything in my head. I could follow conversations more easily, even when people spoke quickly. Most importantly, I felt more confident. Before, I was afraid of making mistakes. But now I understood that making mistakes was part of learning. The more I listened and practiced, the better I got. One of the biggest breakthroughs happened on day 15. I went back to the same cafe where I had struggled on my first day. This time, when the waiter spoke to me, I understood him right away. He asked if I wanted my coffee with sugar or without, and I answered naturally without hesitation. It felt so good to finally communicate without fear. I wasn't just memorizing words anymore. I was actually using them in real life. This experience taught me some valuable lessons about learning a language. First, listening every day is the key to improving. Even if you only understand a little at first, your brain will start recognizing patterns over time. Second, real conversations are the best way to learn. Books and apps can help, but nothing beats listening to actual people speak. And finally, patience is important. At first, it might feel like you're not making progress, but if you keep going, you will see results. Now I want you to think about your own experience with learning English. Have you ever felt frustrated when trying to understand native speakers? Have you ever wanted to join a conversation, but held back because you weren't sure if you would understand? If so, I completely understand how you feel. But I promise you, if you follow the right steps, you will improve just like I did in Spanish. You can train your ears to understand English naturally. Let's dive even deeper into my experience and why listening every day makes such a big difference in your English learning process. If you're serious about improving your English listening skills, you're going to want to pay close attention, because I'm about to share some personal stories, tips, and strategies that can help you make massive progress in just 30 days. When I first started learning English, I didn't have the luxury of studying in an English-speaking country like I did with Spanish in Spain. I didn't have that opportunity to practice with locals, hear the language in different contexts, or really immerse myself in everyday conversations. At first, I relied heavily on textbooks, apps, and grammar exercises. And although I learned many rules, I found it difficult to understand real conversations. When I listened to natural English, it felt overwhelming. Have you ever felt that way when listening to English? You know the words, but the speed throws you off. I remember a specific moment in my early language learning journey. I was watching a popular TV show and I thought I had mastered the vocabulary. So I decided to try and watch it without subtitles. But within the first few minutes, I realized how much I was missing. People were speaking quickly, and they used slang and phrases I had never learned. I felt frustrated and a little defeated. It was clear to me that I had a lot of work to do. It wasn't enough to simply understand isolated words or phrases. I needed to understand real conversations just like you would hear in everyday life. That's when I decided to change my approach. I knew I had to start listening to real-life conversations every day. Conversations that sounded like the ones I would have in daily life. No more textbook dialogues. No more controlled, slow speech. I needed the real stuff. I started by listening to podcasts like the one you're listening to now. I would listen in the morning while making coffee, on my way to work, and sometimes even while I cooked dinner. Even if I didn't understand everything, I didn't stop. I kept listening. At first, it was difficult and I didn't catch much. I often had to rewind or ask myself questions like, what does that word mean? Or, what does this expression really mean in context? But I didn't let it discourage me. Every time I didn't understand something, I wrote it down and researched it later. Slowly over time, I began to notice patterns in the language. I started recognizing phrases that I had heard repeatedly and could guess their meanings. One example that stands out is a common phrase used by my friend Michael when we were in Spain. He would say, "No worries, it's all good." At first, I had no idea what it meant, but after hearing it over and over, I understood it simply meant, "It's okay," or "Don't worry." What helped me the most during that time was focusing on context. When you listen to real-life conversations, the context is key. It's not just about hearing individual words. It's about understanding the meaning behind the words. And that's where the magic happens. The more I listened to conversations and paid attention to the context, the more I understood. For example, Michael used that phrase whenever we relaxed. He said it when we were having fun or didn't need to worry about something. The friendly environment helped me understand what he meant. Even though the individual words weren't exactly familiar to me at first, the meaning became clear through the situation. Context guided my understanding. By the third week of this experiment, I had started to notice real improvements. I was understanding conversations with much more ease. I could pick up on tone, mood, and body language, all of which made understanding spoken language so much clearer. It was incredible. I realized that language is so much more than just the words we use. It's about how we communicate feelings and ideas. Listening to real-life stories and conversations helped me understand English in a more natural, fluid way that textbooks never provided. I also started applying this technique in other areas of my life. For example, I watched movies in English without subtitles. I didn't worry if I missed some words. Instead of translating every word into my native language, I focused on the overall meaning of the scene. This method allowed me to focus on the big picture of communication and helped me understand conversations better in everyday life. One day, I was sitting in a coffee shop in the United States when I had a conversation with a native English speaker. A woman named Sarah had been in the coffee shop for a while working on her laptop. I noticed she was listening to a podcast. I couldn't help but be curious, so I struck up a conversation with her. I asked what she was listening to, and we began talking. We discussed the power of listening and learning a new language. She told me that just like me, she had focused on listening for a month. She wanted to improve her own language skills. She shared how listening to podcasts and watching TV shows helped her understand real-life English. Her story was so inspiring, and I realized that we were both on the same journey of improving listening skills. In that conversation, something clicked for me. Sarah's English sounded so natural, and I could understand her perfectly because she spoke at a normal speed. We both agreed that language learning is all about practice, especially practice that involves real-life situations. The more you listen, the easier it gets. The more you hear people speaking naturally, the more your brain starts to connect the dots. After that conversation, I felt more motivated than ever. I increased my listening time even more. I began listening to podcasts during my commute, at the gym, and even while doing household chores. I didn't just listen passively, I actively engaged with the content. For example, if I heard an interesting word or expression, I paused and repeated it aloud. I tried to match the speaker's intonation and rhythm. I also wrote down any unfamiliar words and looked them up later. This active listening method helped me reinforce new vocabulary and sentence structures. By the end of 30 days, I felt like a different person. Not only had my listening improved dramatically, but I had also started using the new vocabulary and expressions I had learned in my own conversations. The shift from textbook English to real-life English had made all the difference. I wasn't just learning English, I was living it. Now I want to challenge you to do the same. If you want to improve your English listening and speaking, listen every day for 30 days. But make sure you're listening to real conversations, whether it's podcasts, interviews, TV shows, or even everyday interactions. Try to listen to as much real English as possible. Don't worry if you don't understand everything at first. The important part is to stay consistent. Every day takes small steps to improve. Your progress will surprise you. The key is to be patient with yourself. Learning a language is a journey, not a race. And just like me, you'll see the benefits of listening every single day. You'll start noticing patterns in the language. Your vocabulary will grow, and your confidence will skyrocket. Most importantly, you'll feel more connected to the language and the world around you. That's when learning becomes truly fun and rewarding. Remember, here at the English Pod community, we're committed to helping you improve your English every day. We upload new episodes regularly so you can practice. There's always a chance to learn something new. Stay tuned for more tips, real-life stories, and listening practice that can help you reach your goals. Keep listening, keep practicing, and you'll be amazed at how much you can improve. As I kept up with my listening practice, I noticed something interesting happening. My brain started getting used to the rhythm and flow of the English language. At first, everything had sounded too fast, like a blur of words. But after listening every day, my ears adjusted. It was like tuning a radio. At first, it was static. Then, suddenly, the voices became clear. One day, I was at a bookstore, looking through some travel books, when I overheard a conversation between two native English speakers. Normally, I would only catch a few words here and there, but this time, I understood almost everything they were saying, and it felt incredible. They were talking about an upcoming trip to Italy and discussing where they wanted to go. One of them said, "I can't wait to see the Colosseum." He added, "It's been on my bucket list for years." I immediately recognized the phrase bucket list, which means a list of things you want to do. Just a few weeks earlier, I wouldn't have known what that meant. But because I had heard it in podcasts and movies, I understood it instantly. That small moment gave me a huge confidence boost. It proved that listening every day was working. I was no longer just memorizing words. I was understanding how they were actually used in real conversations. I started noticing patterns in the way people spoke and how they used contractions. For example, instead of saying, "What are you doing?" many native speakers say it quickly as "what you doing." These little details made a big difference. Then something even more exciting happened. I was at a cafe and the waiter came up to take my order. Normally, I would feel nervous speaking, but that day I felt different. I had been listening to so many natural conversations that the words just came out without me even thinking. I ordered my coffee and even made a little small talk with the waiter. It was a simple conversation, but it felt amazing to be natural. I spoke without translating in my head. That was a huge moment for me, and that's when I realized listening and speaking are connected. The more you listen, the easier it is to speak. When you hear the same phrases and expressions again and again, they become part of your memory. You don't have to think about grammar rules or translations. The words just come out naturally. And that's exactly how children learn their first language. They listen for months before they ever say their first words. The same thing happens with adults learning a new language. Listening every day changes everything. After that cafe experience, I wanted to test myself even more. I decided to have a full conversation in English with my friend Michael, who is a native speaker. Normally, when I spoke English, I felt a little shy or worried about making mistakes. But this time, I reminded myself that I had been listening every day. I had heard so many conversations, so many different accents, and so many real-life situations. I told myself, you can do this. And guess what? The conversation went great. We talked about travel, work, food, and even funny stories from our childhoods. I noticed I was speaking faster and more naturally. I was using better expressions and feeling more relaxed. Of course, I still made mistakes, but that didn't matter. What mattered was I was communicating confidently. That was the moment I truly understood the power of listening. It wasn't just about understanding words, it was about gaining confidence and improving pronunciation. It was about feeling comfortable in real conversations. At that point, I wanted to take my learning to the next level, so I tried different types of listening. I listened to English news reports, audiobooks, interviews, and even stand-up comedy. Each type of listening gave me something new and valuable to learn. For example, when I listened to interviews, I learned how real conversations flow. People interrupt each other. They use filler words like you know or I mean. This helped me understand the natural rhythm of English. When I listened to audiobooks, I improved my pronunciation because I could hear words clearly and repeat them. Sometimes I paused the audiobook and tried to say the same sentence in the same way. It was like having a pronunciation coach right in my ears. When I listened to comedy, I learned about humor and slang. I didn't always understand the jokes at first, but I didn't give up. I looked up the words I didn't know and tried to understand why the joke was funny. Over time, I started getting it and laughing naturally. One of my favorite moments was watching a stand-up show and actually laughing before the subtitles appeared. It meant I understood in real time. That was a huge achievement for me because it showed listening every day was working. I was connecting with the language on a deeper level. So here's my advice for you. If you want to improve your listening, make it part of your daily life. Listen while cooking, exercising, or commuting, anytime and anywhere. The more you surround yourself with English, the faster you'll improve. And don't worry if you don't understand everything at first. That's completely normal. The key is to keep listening. Your brain is learning even when you don't realize it. And over time, the results will appear. Now let me share one last personal story that really proved to me how much I had improved. A few months after starting my routine, I traveled to New York. It was my first time in an English-speaking country, and I was both excited and nervous. On my first day, I went to a small diner for breakfast. The waitress came up and spoke in a fast, casual way. She said, "Hey there, how's it going? What can I get you?" Before my listening practice, I would have frozen in panic. But this time, I understood her completely. I smiled and answered naturally, "I'm good, thanks." I said, "I'll have some pancakes and coffee, please." She nodded and said, "Sure thing." "You want syrup with that?" Again, I understood instantly and replied, "Yes, please." That conversation may sound simple, but for me, it was a huge success. It showed that all my listening practice had paid off in real life. I wasn't just memorizing words, I was living the language. So if you ever feel frustrated with listening, just remember this. Every time you listen, you improve, even if it feels slow. You are making progress. One day you'll find yourself in a real situation where everything clicks, and you'll see how far you've come. Keep listening, keep practicing, and you'll be amazed at your growth. I know it's easy to get discouraged with English because there are many rules and accents. There are so many words and different ways people speak. But trust me, the journey is worth it. If you focus on listening, you'll see quick changes. I remember when I first started listening to podcasts. It was something I decided to do because I wanted to get used to real, everyday English. At first, it felt too fast, and I was barely catching any words. I often rewound the podcast and listened to the same sentence repeatedly. I wanted to understand the meaning. But what I learned was that repetition is key. It's not about getting everything the first time. It's about exposing yourself to the language over and over again. As I continued listening to different podcasts, my brain began to adjust naturally. I started recognizing familiar sounds, patterns, and words. Slowly but surely, I understood more and more. Then, one day, I listened to a podcast about Japan. The host talked about visiting Tokyo, tasting sushi, and experiencing Japanese culture. Even though the pace was fast, I could understand most of what was said. This was a breakthrough moment for me because it showed me that listening consistently helps you build knowledge and understanding over time. I still remember one of the most useful things I learned from that podcast. The host mentioned how Japanese people often bow when greeting each other. I was surprised because I had never thought about cultural differences in communication before. That little detail showed me how language and culture are connected. As I listened to more podcasts, I noticed more of these cultural insights. It made me feel more connected to the language and more curious. Listening didn't just help me understand the language, it changed how I thought about it. I started appreciating the subtleties of how people really speak. For example, when I heard someone say, "I've got a lot on my plate today," I learned it doesn't mean food. It means you're very busy. This kind of knowledge only comes from listening to real conversations. As I improved, I also saw how important context is when it comes to understanding English. One day, I was listening to a podcast about personal finance. The host said, "It's never too early to start saving. Trust me, your future self will thank you." The phrase "trust me" was something I had heard before, but in that context, I realized it was used to sound friendly and reassuring. Listening to different topics and contexts helped me understand deeper meanings behind words. It also helped me see which phrases fit formal or informal situations. For example, "It's never too early to start saving" is formal, while "you should start saving now" is more casual. Both mean the same but feel different. Listening helped me not only understand what words mean, but how they're used in specific situations. Then something interesting happened with TV shows and movies. A while back, I had tried watching English movies with subtitles and struggled to keep up. But after months of listening practice, I could watch without subtitles. Sure, there were still words I didn't know, but I understood the plot and even the jokes without much difficulty. That was a big milestone for me. I realized that natural speech has tone, pauses, and emphasis. For example, the way someone says, "Wow, that's amazing," can show genuine surprise or sarcasm. These little details matter. I also began noticing how accents and dialects affect listening. At first, I was confused by different accents like Australian English. But after listening more, I became familiar and could understand it clearly. It felt like learning a new version of English, which made me more prepared. When I traveled to the UK, I wasn't intimidated. I had practiced with different accents and felt confident. I even chatted with locals in a cafe. We talked about the weather, their favorite football teams, and more. That conversation made me realize how much I had improved through consistent listening practice. But here's something important to keep in mind. Listening isn't just about understanding words. It's about understanding the meaning behind them and responding naturally in conversations. It's also about feeling confident enough to join in and speak up. I remember when I was in a meeting at work listening carefully. The discussion was about a project we were working on. Several people spoke at once, and they used technical terms I wasn't familiar with. But because I had been listening to English for so long, I caught enough of the conversation to understand what was going on. After the meeting, I felt really proud of myself. I had understood most of the discussion, even though some of the words were new to me. It was a big confidence boost because it showed listening practice was paying off in real life. As I continued, I paid more attention to voices. I noticed that when people are excited, they speak quickly with more energy. But when they're sad, their voices become slower and quieter. This is something you can pick up just by listening. You start to understand not only the words, but also the emotions behind them. By this point, I was starting to feel more comfortable speaking English too. I realized listening was training my brain to think in real situations. The more I listened, the easier it became to speak. I no longer had to search for the right words. I just knew what to say. So here's another tip. Try to listen to different accents, different voices, and different topics. You'll learn a lot by hearing how people speak. Whether it's a casual conversation, a professional meeting, or a funny joke, each conversation helps you get one step closer to mastering the language. Listening to real-life stories like the ones I've shared today can improve your understanding of how language works and how people communicate naturally. You'll start noticing patterns, getting used to different accents, and understanding how context changes the meaning of words. The more you listen, the more confident you'll feel. I also realized something surprising: how much I learned about vocabulary just by listening. Sometimes you think you know a word, but context changes its meaning. For example, there's the word broke. I always thought it just meant having no money, but in real life, it can carry deeper shades of meaning. One day, I listened to a podcast about a trip to New York. The speaker said I was completely broke after that shopping spree. This didn't just mean no money, it meant they had spent so much they had run out of funds. Context gave the word more depth. Another example is when people say the company is broke in a meeting. That shows the meaning shifts depending on situation. Listening reveals these hidden layers. This is something you won't learn by just memorizing vocabulary lists. You have to listen to how people really use the language every day. As I got better at listening, I also started noticing how tone plays a role in communication. Tone can completely change meaning even with one word. Think about when someone says really. It could mean curiosity, disbelief, or sarcasm, depending on how it's said. Listening helps you recognize the difference instantly. At first, I missed these tones because I focused too much on words. But careful listening taught me how emotion and tone are tied together. This also made me more aware of how I should speak. I became more natural and expressive, which made my conversation smoother and clearer. Another time, I was listening to a podcast about a traveler's experience in Italy. The host told a story about getting lost in Rome. He said I thought I knew the city, but it turns out the streets in Rome are a maze. That phrase struck me deeply. It turns out was more than just words. It showed reflection and realization. Little phrases like this appear constantly in real conversations. I began noticing useful expressions such as, to be honest. People often use it before giving their true opinions or feelings, even if it's difficult. For example, you could say, to be honest, I didn't enjoy the movie. It makes the message more open and straightforward for the listener. These natural phrases make language feel alive, but it wasn't always easy. Sometimes I felt frustrated because I couldn't understand everything in the conversation. One of the hardest moments was a podcast about the stock market. The host used terms like bull market and bear market, which confused me. Instead of giving up, I researched those terms. I learned a bull market means the stock market is doing well, and a bear market means poorly. Once I understood, I listened again and grasped much more. That taught me learning vocabulary through listening is powerful for tackling complex topics. It also showed me something important. Language learning isn't always about knowing every word. It's about catching the overall message and filling gaps with context. Another interesting moment happened when I listened to a podcast about childhood in the United States. The host described Sunday breakfasts at a local diner. He said we'd sit down to steaming plates of pancakes with maple syrup dripping down the sides. The description was vivid and full of life. This wasn't just about food, it was an experience. Listening taught me how important descriptive language is. It makes conversations more engaging and memorable. I realized I could improve my own speech by adding more description. Instead of just saying I ate breakfast, I could paint the picture. I could say I had a steaming cup of coffee with warm bread and butter. That makes the listener see and feel the moment clearly. These details make conversations colorful and lively. Listening showed me that it's not only about words, but also about connecting with others emotionally. I remember hearing a story about friends who traveled together. They shared adventures, challenges, and the bonds they built across cultures. That made me realize English isn't just a tool for communication, it's a way to build relationships and connect with people from different backgrounds. When you listen to stories like these, think about the people behind the words. Notice the emotions, the tone, and the humanity in their voices. Each podcast or story you listen to is an invitation to enter another world, to see life through their experiences, and to learn their language. Over time, these stories helped me feel like I was part of the conversation too. Listening bridged the gap between learning and living the language. As I continued listening, my speaking skills improved naturally. At first, I was nervous, but paying attention to pauses, intonation, and rhythm changed my fluency. Listening taught me how to structure sentences and sound more fluent. It even showed me how to react naturally in conversations, not just answer mechanically. For example, when someone tells a funny story, you don't just say that's funny. You can say, no way, that's incredible, or I can't believe it. These natural responses make you sound engaged. Listening to stories also showed me how humor works in English and how people use it to connect. I remember a podcast where the host told a funny story about getting lost in a city. The laughter in their voice was contagious. I realized humor is a huge part of communication. It breaks the ice and makes conversations more enjoyable. It also builds stronger connections with others. So listening to real stories not only improved my English, but helped me understand how to use language to connect with people personally. As we continue exploring how listening can help improve your English, I want to share how understanding real-life situations shaped my journey and learning process. When I started listening to authentic English content, I began noticing how much language is shaped by situations. It's not about big words, it's about daily communication. For example, I remember listening to a podcast about a trip to London. The speaker shared a funny story about finding directions to Big Ben. He said I must have asked at least 5 people for directions, and everyone gave me a different answer. By the time I got there, I was lost. This wasn't just a travel story. It showed how people use natural expressions and humor in real conversations. The phrase "I must have asked" stood out. It didn't only mean he asked. It emphasized certainty and exaggeration. I started using must have myself when describing busy days or repeated actions in conversations. I realized that we use experiences to connect. The host didn't only share a fact, he shared feelings of confusion, frustration, and humor through his language. By listening, I saw how adding emotions makes language richer. It wasn't just about what happened, but how he felt, and that made it engaging. Another example came from a wedding story on a podcast. The speaker said, I went to this wedding last weekend, and let me tell you, it was amazing. He described the ceremony as beautiful, emotional, and full of love. When he said you could feel it in the air, it gave a vivid picture. Listening taught me that expressions like "you could feel it in the air" are powerful. They don't just describe events. They create emotional images for listeners. I started using phrases like "the energy was amazing" or "it felt magical" in my speech. They make conversations more alive than simply saying it was nice. The beauty of listening is that it shows how people connect words to feelings. That's what makes communication real and keeps listeners interested. I also remember listening to an interview with someone who lived abroad. He shared how he missed home during his first year in a new country. He said, at first, I was excited to be in a new place, but after a few months, I started to miss little things. He described the smell of fresh bread in the morning, That detail made me nostalgic too, even though it was about someone else's experience. That story showed me the power of language to create emotions. It's not just about facts, it's about how words make you feel inside. I realized that to sound natural, you must describe emotions, not only events. Instead of saying, I like this, you can say it made me feel happy. These shifts make your speech richer and more relatable. Listening every day helped me add emotional depth to my English and share stories more effectively. I also learned the importance of phrases like handle it. I heard someone say, I work in an office with a lot of meetings, but now I handle it. That phrase doesn't just mean manage, it shows dealing with challenges confidently. Learning phrases like this gave me tools to express myself more naturally. At first, I didn't know how to describe situations like stress or responsibility, but by listening, I picked up real expressions to replace simple words like hard. Instead of saying it was difficult, I could say I had to handle a lot of things. That sounds more natural and confident in conversations. Another valuable lesson came from hearing people talk about passions. One speaker said every weekend, I spend hours walking around the city taking photos. I love it. He didn't just say I like photography. He showed his excitement and passion by describing his actions and feelings. That's the power of natural communication. I began expressing my hobbies the same way. Instead of saying, I like football, I said I'm really into football. I spend hours playing. I can't get enough. Adding detail and emotion made my speech more dynamic, and listening gave me examples to copy. Real stories taught me how to show enthusiasm with energy. I also learned the importance of humor. One podcast told a story about a comedian's first performance. He said I was so nervous I forgot my jokes, but the audience laughed anyway. The way he told it was full of humor, exaggeration, and self-reflection. It showed how humor builds connections with others. I realized humor doesn't require perfection. Even mistakes can be funny and create memorable moments. I started adding humor to my conversations after listening to such stories. These real-life stories showed me that learning English isn't just about rules or grammar. It's about connecting, expressing, and making people feel something through words. Another podcast talked about moving abroad. A woman said, I didn't know anyone, and at first I felt totally out of place. But people welcomed me. She described visiting a local market, trying new food, and feeling strange, but eventually comfortable. Phrases like totally out of place showed her emotions clearly. By listening, I learned that sharing feelings adds depth to stories. Instead of saying I was nervous, I now use I had butterflies in my stomach. These expressions paint pictures for listeners and make them feel your emotions. That's what makes stories relatable and conversations natural. I also heard stories about failure. One speaker said I studied so hard but failed the test. I was devastated, but I asked for help. He worked with a tutor and passed the next time. That showed me resilience. Instead of saying I failed, I now say I figured out what went wrong. Listening taught me to describe both setbacks and solutions, not just facts. It made my conversations more constructive, showing growth and strength instead of weakness. Real conversations also taught me that mistakes are part of learning. I heard a man say I was afraid of mistakes, but my best conversations came from them. That changed my perspective. I began saying, I've made many mistakes, but I'm getting better every day. That sounds more hopeful and real than I'm bad at English. Language is about expressing journeys, not perfection. Listening to people share how they overcame struggles gave me courage to tell my own stories in English. These moments convinced me that listening daily transforms your language. It's not just practice, it's living the language, feeling it, and learning through real human stories. Now let's talk about simple but powerful ways to use language to connect with people. One thing I noticed is how people ask for help. There's a subtle but important difference in how we ask, depending on the situation. At a restaurant, you might say, "Excuse me, could you explain this dish?" But if you're talking with a friend, you might say, "Hey, can you help me out with this? I'm not sure I get it." Both ask for help, but the tone and context are different. Listening to real conversations teaches you how to adapt your words to the moment. It makes you sound more natural. Another example came from two friends talking. One said, "I had the best time. I went to the beach daily." He added it was exactly what I needed to recharge. This showed me how to express happiness and satisfaction in a detailed and authentic way. Instead of saying I had a good time, I now say I had the best time hiking. It was peaceful. Exactly what I needed. Listening to real-life stories teaches not just how to share experiences, but also how to understand others' emotions and perspectives more clearly. You learn the words they use, the way they express feelings, and the small details that make conversations meaningful and engaging for listeners. I realized that every conversation can teach something valuable. Listening showed me how people use language in daily life, whether about work, hobbies, or relationships. One of the best ways to learn English is by observing how people share their daily lives. Simple phrases like, "I'm busy today," carry hidden meanings. When a friend says, "I have a lot to do," they're not only listing tasks, they're also sharing feelings of stress, busyness, or being overwhelmed. I remember a colleague saying, "I had a long day at work, everything went wrong, and I was exhausted by the time I got home." The phrase "long day" immediately makes you imagine frustration and fatigue. Adding exhausted deepens the picture. It's more vivid than just saying, "I was tired." That moment taught me something important. How you say something in English is just as important as the words you choose to use. Instead of saying "I had a busy day," I now say everything felt like it was happening at once, and by evening I was drained. That makes the story richer and more engaging. It shows not only what happened, but how I felt, making my conversations more interesting and real. Another overlooked part of language learning is storytelling. People don't only share facts, they tell stories with a beginning, middle, and end to keep interest. I remember a friend talking about learning to cook. She said, "At first, I was terrible. I burned everything, but eventually I got better." Now she cooks her favorite dishes easily. That story was more than learning to cook. It was about struggle, practice, and satisfaction from progress. If she only said "I learned to cook," it wouldn't be engaging. Adding struggle and improvement made it inspiring. Listening taught me this storytelling structure. I also listened to a podcast where someone described traveling to a new city. They said, "When I first arrived, I was overwhelmed by sights and sounds. But after a few days, I felt more at home. I discovered the best coffee shops and made new friends." The story showed growth and adaptation. It wasn't just travel, it was a journey of change. I realized I didn't need perfect experiences to tell interesting stories. Even challenges make them engaging. Listeners connect with emotions of nervousness, confusion, and relief. That's what makes a story powerful and helps others relate to your experiences through language. Another example was a conversation with a friend about personal growth. She said, "I used to be shy, but now I'm confident because of experiences." The phrase used to be contrasted with "now I'm," showing change and transformation. That made her growth clear and her story inspiring to hear. I started using this structure myself. Instead of just saying, "I'm confident now," I say, "I used to struggle with speaking, but now I can do it easily." This gives context, shows growth, and makes the story relatable. Listening helped me understand how to talk about change, not just the present situation. Another lesson I learned is about mistakes. At first, I feared speaking English because of errors, but a friend's story changed my perspective completely. He said once I told someone, "I go to the store yesterday," the listener gently corrected me, saying, "You mean I went to the store yesterday?" He felt embarrassed, but realized mistakes are part of learning. That story stuck with me. It taught me mistakes are not failures. They're steps toward improvement. Even native speakers make mistakes. Communication is not about perfection. It's about sharing your message and learning along the way through every attempt you make. I began practicing without fear. I started saying things like, "I didn't understand that. Can you say it again?" Or, "I'm still learning. Please be patient." People appreciated my honesty, and it made conversations more natural. Listening showed me real learners make mistakes too, and they grow because of persistence. I also realized repetition is key. The more you hear words or phrases, the more they stick. That's why listening every day makes progress natural and steady. For example, I heard phrases like, "I can't believe this is happening," or "This is crazy" repeatedly in shows. Soon, I recognized and used them naturally. At first, I didn't catch everything, but repetition made me comfortable. It's the same with grammar, rhythm, and pronunciation. Listening trains your ears automatically. One podcast made me laugh when the host said, "I couldn't even order coffee without feeling nervous." I understood the humor because I had felt the same. It reminded me that laughing at yourself is part of learning. Awkward moments are lessons. Listening to such stories showed me language is also about fun. Another powerful thing I learned is storytelling's ability to inspire. People don't only share information, they share emotions, struggles, and victories that connect listeners to their journey. I told my own story of becoming a teacher. At first, I didn't think I could. I was shy and lacked confidence. But I volunteered. When I saw students excited to learn, I felt pride. That story wasn't about teaching lessons, it was about helping people grow and finding my purpose. Listening taught me that storytelling turns simple experiences into meaningful lessons. It transforms facts into emotions and makes communication powerful and memorable. That's the magic of storytelling. You can turn a simple experience into something meaningful by adding emotion and context, making learning English exciting and impactful. It's not just about mastering vocabulary, it's about learning how to tell your story in a way that makes an impression on others. So when you're practicing English, think about the stories you want to tell, the experiences that shaped you, and the lessons they carry. Think about the emotions you felt. Then practice sharing those stories in English. The more you practice, the better you'll express yourself naturally and clearly. You'll learn to communicate not only with words, but also with emotions and experiences. That's what makes conversations meaningful and inspiring for others to hear. I hope today's episode showed you that learning English isn't just memorizing words or rules. It's about expressing yourself and connecting with others authentically. Remember, it's okay to make mistakes. Each mistake is a step forward in your learning journey, a sign of progress rather than failure. The more you listen to real stories and practice speaking, the more confident you'll become in your ability to communicate with clarity and feeling. So keep pushing forward, be patient with yourself, and enjoy the process. Every little improvement deserves celebration, no matter how small it feels. Thanks for joining me today on the English Pod community. I hope you enjoyed this episode and found encouragement in my personal stories and reflections. I can't wait to share more real-life stories and language tips with you in the next one. Keep practicing and keep learning every single day. Remember, English is a journey, not a destination. Until next time, take care and stay motivated. Your progress is waiting just ahead if you keep going. As I continued practicing listening, I noticed something fascinating. My brain started adjusting naturally to the rhythm and flow of English conversations. At first, everything sounded too fast, like a blur of words rushing together. But after listening daily, my ears tuned in and speech became clearer. It was like tuning a radio. At first, all I heard was static, but slowly the voices became sharp and distinct, filling me with confidence. One day in a bookstore, I overheard two native speakers talking about Italy. Normally, I'd catch only fragments, but this time I understood almost everything. They mentioned the Colosseum, saying it had been on their bucket list for years. I immediately recognized the phrase because I'd heard it in podcasts before. That small moment was huge for me. I knew I was improving because I could follow a real conversation without needing translation or subtitles to help. It gave me confidence to keep going. Listening every day really was changing my brain, making English feel natural instead of foreign or overwhelming. I started noticing contractions and how people connected words. Instead of saying, "What are you doing?" they said, "What you doing?" which sounded quicker but natural. These details made me realize listening builds awareness of how people actually speak, not just how textbooks present the language. That difference was incredibly valuable. Another milestone came in a cafe when I ordered coffee. Normally, I'd feel nervous, but that day, the words flowed without thinking or translating in my head. I even made small talk with the waiter. It wasn't a deep conversation, but it felt amazing to speak naturally, like part of the community. That's when I truly understood that listening and speaking are connected. The more you listen, the easier speaking becomes because phrases settle in your memory. You don't have to think about grammar or structure. The words just come. This is exactly how children learn to talk, and adults can too. Listening every day is like training your brain to produce language automatically. It prepares you for real conversations in ways textbooks can never replace. Encouraged by this, I pushed myself further. I had a full conversation in English with my friend Michael, who is a native speaker. Before, I'd always felt shy or afraid of mistakes. But this time, I reminded myself I'd listened to countless conversations with many accents and contexts. The conversation went smoothly. We talked about work, travel, food, and even childhood stories. I was speaking faster, using better expressions, and feeling more relaxed. Of course, I still made mistakes, but I didn't care. What mattered was that I was communicating confidently and enjoying the conversation instead of fearing it. That experience confirmed the power of listening. It wasn't only about comprehension, it was about confidence, fluency, and being able to participate in real situations. After that, I wanted to expand my practice. I started listening to news, audiobooks, interviews, and comedy, each teaching me something new about English. News taught me clear pronunciation and formal phrases. Interviews taught me conversation flow. Audiobooks helped me repeat sentences correctly. Comedy introduced me to humor and slang. At first, comedy was hardest. I didn't get the jokes, but I researched unknown words and contexts. Slowly, I started laughing naturally, understanding cultural humor too. One of my proudest moments was laughing at a stand-up show before the subtitles appeared. It proved I understood English in real time, without translation. That feeling was incredible. Listening had transformed not just my skills, but also my confidence and enjoyment of the language. It truly felt like progress. So my advice for you is simple. Make listening part of your life daily. Do it while cooking, exercising, or commuting, even in small amounts. Don't worry about missing some words. What matters is consistency. Your brain will keep learning in the background, and soon you'll notice big improvements. I promise. The more you listen, the more confident and natural you'll feel in English. That's how language becomes part of your life. Let me share another personal story that showed me how far I had come. A few months after starting my listening routine, I traveled to New York. It was my first time in an English-speaking country, and I felt both excited and nervous. On the very first morning, I visited a small diner. The waitress came up quickly and said in a casual way, "Hey there, how's it going? What can I get you?" She spoke fast and naturally. Before my listening practice, I would have panicked, but this time I understood her completely, smiled, and replied naturally, "I'm good, thanks. I'll have pancakes and coffee." She nodded and said, "Sure thing. You want syrup with that?" I instantly understood and answered, "Yes, please." The whole conversation flowed without hesitation or fear. It may sound simple, but for me, it was huge. That little exchange proved that all my practice had paid off in a real situation. I wasn't just memorizing words anymore. I was living the language. Every moment listening had prepared me for that breakfast conversation. And I felt proud. So if you ever feel frustrated with listening, remember every time you listen, you're improving, even if progress feels slow. One day, it will click. You'll suddenly understand a conversation and realize how far you've come. That's why listening is so powerful. It builds skills quietly until confidence arrives suddenly. Of course, English is tricky. There are countless rules, thousands of words, and many accents. But the journey is worth it if you keep going consistently. I decided to push myself further by listening to podcasts every day. At first, the speed was overwhelming and I barely caught any words. I rewound sentences again and again, trying to understand. But repetition taught me it's not about getting everything the first time, it's about consistent exposure. The more I listened, the more my brain adjusted. Patterns became familiar. And soon, I could follow conversations more easily without translating in my head. One day, I listened to a podcast about Japan. The host described Tokyo, sushi, and Japanese culture. The pace was fast, yet I understood most of it. That was a breakthrough moment. It proved consistent listening builds comprehension steadily, even when the topic is new. Familiar sounds and patterns help you understand. I still remember the host talking about bowing in Japan as a cultural greeting. That detail surprised me and showed me how language and culture connect deeply. As I listened to more podcasts, I noticed these little cultural insights. They made me feel more connected to the language and more curious about people. Listening changed not only my understanding, but also my mindset. I began appreciating subtleties, tone, and humor. I saw English as more than words and grammar. For example, I heard someone say, "I've got a lot on my plate today." I learned it doesn't mean food, but instead it means very busy. This kind of knowledge can only be gained by listening to real conversations. Textbooks rarely teach these nuances, but real speech shows you true meaning. Another time, I listened to a podcast about personal finance. The host said, "It's never too early to start saving. Trust me, your future self will thank you." I realized, trust me. Here wasn't just two words, it was reassurance, a friendly tone to make the listener feel comfortable. Context revealed its real use. Listening to various topics helped me understand which phrases are formal and which are casual. For example, "Start saving now" feels casual compared to "never too early." That made me realize English is flexible. Words shift meaning depending on tone and setting. Listening helped me recognize when and how to use them. Soon, I noticed TV and movies becoming easier too. Before, I needed subtitles to survive, but after consistent listening practice, I could enjoy films naturally. Yes, there were still unknown words, but I understood plots and even jokes without much difficulty. That was a milestone that gave me real confidence. I realized natural speech involves tone, pauses, and emphasis. For example, the way someone says, "Wow, that's amazing," can show genuine excitement or sarcastic disbelief. These subtle cues are invisible in textbooks, but obvious in real voices. Listening daily trained my ears to catch them, making conversations much clearer and richer. I also discovered accents no longer scared me. At first, Australian English confused me badly, but listening often made me familiar, like learning a new version. Later, when I traveled to the UK, I wasn't intimidated at all. I had practiced different accents, so speaking to locals felt natural and comfortable. I even chatted with strangers in a cafe about football and weather. That conversation proved I had grown from a nervous learner to a confident speaker. These experiences taught me listening is about much more than vocabulary. It builds understanding, confidence, and the courage to use English in real situations. Another important thing I discovered was that listening isn't just about understanding words. It's about capturing emotions, tone, and the deeper meaning behind conversations. For example, when colleagues spoke quickly during meetings, I realized their speed often reflected excitement, stress, or urgency. Listening carefully revealed emotions hidden inside their words. I learned to respond more naturally, not just with correct vocabulary, but with the right tone. This made my conversations smoother and more authentic. I also noticed how common phrases reveal mindset. Instead of saying, "I'm nervous," many people said, "I've got butterflies in my stomach," which paints a vivid picture. This expression helped me express emotions more colorfully. Instead of simply saying I was scared, I began describing feelings with imagery that listeners could truly imagine. Listening exposed me to countless such expressions. They gave me tools to speak in ways that were more interesting, personal, and relatable for real communication. I also realized failures could be powerful teachers. One podcast speaker said I studied so hard but failed. I was devastated. Yet I asked for help. He worked daily with a tutor, and next time, he passed with flying colors. That story showed me resilience and how to talk about setbacks positively. Instead of saying, "I failed," I learned to say I didn't do as well as I hoped, but I figured out how to improve. This language makes conversations constructive, not negative. It shows learning, persistence, and hope, which makes listeners more inspired instead of discouraged by your story. Another podcast featured someone describing their routine. They said, "Every morning I wake at 6 a.m., make coffee, and go running to clear my mind." That simple story taught me how powerful details can be. Instead of saying, "I wake early," I now share actions and feelings that add color. Listening daily made me appreciate storytelling. It's not only about grammar or vocabulary, it's about connecting with others by painting pictures with your words. Another powerful story was about handling stress. A speaker said, "I had a huge presentation and felt nervous, but I breathed deeply, focused, and did my best." He explained it went better than expected. That story showed me how to describe challenges with emotions and solutions, not just saying I was nervous. I began saying I was nervous but focused and pushed through, which shows growth. It sounds more hopeful and mature than simply saying I was scared. Listening also taught me the role of humor in language. One story described being caught in the rain without an umbrella, looking like leaving a swimming pool. The speaker joked people looked at him as if he had caused the rain. This humor made the story vivid and memorable for listeners. I learned that humor doesn't need perfect language. It's about exaggeration, imagery, and timing. Adding lightness makes conversations fun and keeps people engaged. Another example was someone's cooking disaster. They burned breakfast but laughed and ate cereal instead. That positive attitude turned a mistake into a funny story. I started practicing the same. If things went wrong, I used humor in English to keep conversations enjoyable instead of feeling embarrassed or awkward. Listening to these stories showed me communication isn't about being perfect. It's about being human. Mistakes, humor, and emotions are what make language come alive. Another lesson came from a podcast about passion. The host said every weekend, I take my camera and spend hours photographing anything that catches my eye. He explained, "I don't care if people think I'm strange. I love it." That level of excitement inspired me to express my hobbies with passion. Instead of saying I like reading, I began saying I can't stop reading. I spend hours with books, and they bring me endless joy. Listening gave me confidence to add enthusiasm to my speech. Emotions transform ordinary sentences into powerful connections, making conversations memorable for both speaker and listener. I also realized how context shapes meaning. A man said, I had to handle many meetings. That phrase handle showed control and confidence, not just hard work. Learning these subtle differences made my English sound more natural. Listening showed me how the same word changes meaning depending on setting and tone. Over time, listening daily transformed how I used English. I no longer worried about every single word. Instead, I focused on meaning, tone, and connection. That shift made me more confident, fluent, and comfortable. I wasn't just studying English, I was living it through stories, conversations, and everyday practice. One of the biggest lessons I learned is that listening helps you understand culture, not just words. Language always carries traditions, humor, and emotional context. I remember hearing a podcast about childhood in America. The host described Sunday breakfasts at a diner, with steaming pancakes and syrup dripping slowly down the sides. That description transported me there. It wasn't just about food, it was about family, routine, and feelings. Listening taught me how to describe life more vividly. I realized I could make my own conversations more interesting by adding details. Instead of saying I had breakfast, I describe the smells and tastes. That makes listeners imagine the scene. Listening also showed me how emotions color stories. A speaker said, I missed home after months abroad, feeling totally out of place. That phrase, totally out of place, carried deep meaning. It didn't just describe loneliness, it captured emotions. By listening, I learned to use such phrases naturally. Instead of saying I was lonely, I can say I felt out of place until I found friends. That paints a truer picture for listeners. Another lesson came from mistakes. At first, I feared speaking, but then I realized mistakes are part of learning. Even native speakers make them every day. A friend told me he once said, I go to the store yesterday. Someone corrected him gently, and he laughed. Realizing mistakes don't matter much, that story gave me courage. I started telling people I'm still learning. Please be patient. Surprisingly, people appreciated my honesty and helped me improve. That changed everything. I no longer avoided conversations. Instead, I practiced more, laughed at mistakes, and grew faster. Listening gave me examples of resilience in learning. Another discovery was repetition. I heard the same phrases so many times in podcasts and shows that they became part of my memory automatically. Expressions like, I can't believe this, or that's crazy, appeared often. Soon, I started recognizing them instantly and using them in my own conversations naturally. At first, I didn't notice progress, but repetition built familiarity. My brain started treating these sounds as normal, and English became less foreign and more natural. One day, I heard someone say, I've got a lot on my plate today. Thanks to repeated listening, I instantly understood it meant being busy. That moment showed me how listening trains your brain subconsciously, even when you don't feel improvement. Your ears are adjusting and storing language patterns silently. Another powerful thing I realized was that humor helps. One podcast host joked about failing to order coffee because nerves froze him. I laughed and related instantly. That humor reminded me not to take mistakes too seriously. Laughing at awkward moments makes language learning more fun and less stressful. Keeping motivation alive. I also notice storytelling inspires learning. People don't just share facts, they share struggles, lessons, and emotions. That's what keeps listeners engaged and connected. I once told my story about teaching. At first, I doubted myself. I was shy, but volunteering showed me pride in helping others learn confidently. That story wasn't about lessons, it was about growth. Listening taught me how storytelling turns simple experiences into something meaningful that inspires others. I realized English isn't just grammar or vocabulary. It's about expressing who you are, what you feel, and how you connect with others. Listening gave me the courage to do that. Slowly, I moved from studying to living the language, which made my journey more exciting and rewarding. So my advice is simple. Surround yourself with English every day. Listen to podcasts, conversations, movies, or songs. Let English become part of your daily life. Don't focus on perfection. Focus on connection, meaning, and practice. Progress may feel slow, but one day you'll realize everything has changed and confidence has arrived. As I kept listening, I also noticed how people use tone and rhythm to show meaning. Sometimes the same words could carry totally different feelings. For example, when someone said really with rising intonation, it sounded curious. But when they said really with a flat tone, it sounded sarcastic or doubtful. These differences are subtle, but they completely change the message. Listening helped me recognize them and use my own voice more naturally in conversations. Another podcast story was about travel in Rome. The speaker said, "I thought I knew the city, but it turns out the streets are a maze." That phrase, "it turns out," showed realization and reflection. It made the story sound deeper than just saying I got lost. Adding a layer of meaning, I began noticing many phrases like "as it turns out," "to be honest," or "at the end of the day." They enrich conversations with natural rhythm. Textbooks don't always teach them, but listening exposes you to them repeatedly. Soon, they became part of my own speech without effort or memorization lists. I also discovered the importance of filler words. In interviews, people often said, I mean, or kind of while explaining ideas. At first, I thought these were mistakes, but I realized they make speech sound natural. Using them lightly made me sound less robotic when speaking. Listening showed me real conversations aren't perfect. People pause, repeat, or adjust. That gave me confidence because I didn't need to be flawless to communicate well. Another breakthrough came when I listened to comedy. The host exaggerated stories and added humor. I realized humor makes conversations memorable, even when the language is simple. One story was about being late and blaming traffic. The way it was told made everyone laugh. I saw humor can connect people instantly. I started practicing by adding small jokes when things went wrong. Instead of being embarrassed, I turned mistakes into funny moments that made conversations enjoyable. Another lesson came from cultural references. In a comedy podcast, someone said it was like a scene from a sitcom. I didn't understand until I researched. Then I realized culture and language go together. To fully understand English, you also need to know cultural habits, traditions, and humor. Listening gives you that exposure. I also learned that describing feelings brings stories to life. One speaker said, "I felt my heart race before the big presentation, but I took a breath." That description made me feel their nerves. It was more powerful than just saying I was nervous. I started using similar imagery in my speech. Instead of saying I was scared, I might say my hands were shaking. These details make listeners connect with your feelings, not just understand your words. Listening helped me practice this skill. Over time, I realized that language is about painting pictures, not just building sentences. That changed the way I spoke. Another important lesson came from stories about failure and growth. One speaker said I hit rock bottom, but I decided to start fresh and keep going. That phrase, "hit rock bottom," became unforgettable for me. It described a difficult moment vividly. It showed pain, but also resilience, which inspired me deeply. I realized language isn't just words. It's courage, hope, and emotions. Listening to stories like these helped me express struggles and victories in my own journey. I also heard inspiring success stories. One businessman said, "I started with nothing, no money, no experience, but I kept pushing and built a company step by step." The way he told it wasn't about achievements alone. It was about the hard road and persistence. Phrases like "I kept pushing forward" inspired me greatly. I learned to use similar phrases to describe my progress in English. Instead of saying, "I studied hard," I say I kept pushing every day. This shows determination and makes my story more engaging. Listening gave me both the language and the mindset to share experiences with confidence and emotion. Every story I listened to became a lesson. Some taught me vocabulary, some taught tone, others taught culture. But all of them taught me connection. That's why I believe listening is the key to mastering English. It doesn't just train your ears, it changes your heart, your confidence, and your voice. In addition to success stories, I also learned so much from listening to people talk about everyday experiences. These stories seemed simple but carried powerful language. For example, one woman said, "Every morning, I wake up at 6 a.m., make coffee, and go running." That routine revealed values, discipline, and priorities. It showed me that talking about daily habits isn't just about describing actions. It's about sharing what matters to you and how you live your life. I realized that instead of saying I wake up early, I could say I wake up at 6, make coffee, and run to clear my mind. This adds color and detail. It helps the listener imagine my morning and connect with me personally. Listening taught me how to share habits more naturally. Another podcast described handling stress. A speaker said, "I had a huge presentation. I was nervous, but I breathed deeply and focused, and it went well." That shift from fear to confidence was powerful. It taught me to speak about challenges honestly, but with solutions. Not just repeating "I was nervous" many times. I started practicing similar phrases. Instead of saying, "I'm scared," I say "I'm nervous, but I'll focus and do my best." It sounds hopeful and strong. Listening also showed me how humor helps with difficult situations. One man described being drenched in rain. Joking, he looked like he caused the storm himself. That humor made the story unforgettable. It taught me that exaggeration and playful comparisons make language lively and conversations enjoyable, even in uncomfortable circumstances. Another podcast told a cooking story. A speaker said, "I burned breakfast but laughed and ate cereal instead." That positive attitude turned failure into a funny memory. I realized I could do the same. Instead of being embarrassed by mistakes, I could laugh at them and make conversations lighter and friendlier. Listening gave me endless examples of resilience. People didn't hide struggles. They shared them with honesty and humor. That inspired me to embrace mistakes in English. I also learned that listening improves not only vocabulary but cultural understanding. For example, in finance podcasts, I heard "trust me" used for reassurance and friendliness. I had read "trust me" before, but listening showed me how it builds connection in casual speech. Context revealed meaning that books alone couldn't provide. I also noticed how words change between formal and informal situations. For example, "start saving now" is casual, but "it's never too early to save" is formal. Listening taught me to recognize tone and choose words for different contexts. That skill is essential for natural communication, especially in professional or social settings. I also grew more comfortable with accents. At first, Australian or British English confused me, but listening repeatedly made them familiar, almost like new languages within English. Later, when I spoke with locals in the UK, I wasn't intimidated. I had practiced enough through listening to handle new sounds and rhythms confidently. One cafe conversation in London proved it. We talked about football, weather, and daily life. I understood clearly and replied naturally without fear or hesitation. That's when I realized listening isn't only practice, it's preparation. Every podcast, movie, or story prepares you for real conversations that you'll face one day. Another lesson came from descriptive language. In one podcast, a host described breakfast as steaming pancakes with syrup dripping down. That vivid image made me feel present. I started practicing descriptions in my speech. Instead of saying, I ate bread, I'd say, I enjoyed warm bread with butter melting slowly. It made my English vivid. Listening also taught me to appreciate idioms. Expressions like butterflies in my stomach or a lot on my plate gave me tools to describe emotions more creatively. At first, they felt confusing, but repeated exposure made them clear. Soon, I started using them myself, and people reacted by saying my English sounded natural. That feedback motivated me to keep going. I wasn't just learning, I was connecting, making conversations meaningful and interesting for both me and my listeners. Over time, I realized listening is the foundation of speaking. The more you listen, the easier words flow when it's your turn to talk. You don't have to force sentences. They come naturally because your brain has absorbed rhythms, patterns, and expressions from countless real-life examples. That's why I believe listening every day is the most powerful habit for language learners. It transforms not just your ears, but also your voice. Another great benefit of listening is learning how people naturally react in conversations. For example, when someone shares good news, they don't just say that's nice. They say no way, that's amazing, or I can't believe it. These reactions show genuine excitement, and listening helped me copy them in my own speech. It made me sound more engaged and natural. Instead of giving flat responses, I began adding energy, which made conversations feel alive and connected for both people. I also learned that humor builds trust. In one podcast, the host shared a story about getting lost and exaggerating it for laughs. The audience loved it. I realized humor doesn't need perfect grammar. It needs timing, expression, and honesty. Adding humor to my own stories made me more confident and likable. Another lesson came from stories about passion. A photographer said every weekend I spend hours taking pictures around the city. I don't care if people think I'm odd. That passion inspired me to express my hobbies more vividly. Instead of saying I like football, I began saying I spend hours playing and can't get enough. Adding emotion made my conversations more dynamic and memorable. Listening gave me endless examples of how passion shapes language and turns simple hobbies into meaningful stories. Another powerful insight was the importance of tone. When someone said really with a smile, it sounded curious, but said flatly, it meant doubt or disbelief. These subtle differences matter. Listening daily trained my ears to catch emotions hidden in voices. Soon, I understood not only words, but also feelings behind them. That changed how I spoke too. I started paying attention to my own tone, making sure my voice matched my emotions for clearer communication. Another milestone came when I realized real conversations aren't perfect. People pause, repeat, or change direction mid-sentence. Listening helped me see mistakes are part of natural speech. This gave me freedom. I didn't need perfect grammar to join conversations. I just needed confidence and willingness to communicate like real people do. Another podcast showed me resilience. A man said I studied hard but failed a test. I was devastated, but I got help and passed next time. That story inspired me. I realized failure isn't the end. It's part of growth. Listening taught me how to talk about setbacks constructively and with hope. Instead of saying I failed, I now say I didn't do as well as I hoped, but I improved. That sounds strong and optimistic. Listening also helped me understand culture. For example, in America, people often say, have a nice day casually. At first, it felt strange, but I learned it's normal. These cultural phrases matter. They make conversations smoother and friendlier. Listening taught me when to use them, so I sounded natural instead of awkward. Another discovery was idioms. I often heard phrases like hit rock bottom or on my bucket list. At first, confusing, but context made them clear. I started using them myself, and people noticed my English sounded more natural. Listening daily helped me absorb these expressions without memorization or stress. Another inspiring moment came from a businessman's story. He said, I started with nothing, no money, no experience, but I kept pushing, and now I run a company. The way he told it wasn't about success alone, it was about persistence and struggle. Listening taught me to use phrases like, I kept pushing forward. This gave me tools to describe my own learning journey with power. Instead of saying, I studied English, I say, I kept pushing every day. These small changes made my English sound alive. Listening gave me not just vocabulary, but also courage, resilience, and passion reflected in the way I spoke. That's why I believe listening is the heart of language learning. It gives you vocabulary, culture, tone, and confidence, all in one daily habit. I also learned the importance of descriptive details. In one podcast about childhood memories, the speaker said we sat down to steaming pancakes with maple syrup dripping. That description wasn't just food, it was an experience. It made me feel like I was there, smelling the sweetness and hearing plates clink on tables. Listening taught me how to make my own stories richer. Instead of saying, I ate bread, I say I enjoyed warm bread with melting butter. This paints a picture for the listener. Details bring stories to life, making them memorable and more engaging than simple statements without imagery or emotion. Another podcast described growing up abroad. The speaker said at first I was excited, but after months, I missed small things like fresh bread in the morning. That story touched me. It reminded me language is tied to culture and memory. Words carry emotions, and listening helps you feel those emotions clearly. I also noticed how context gives meaning. A man said I had to handle so many meetings. The word handle implied confidence, not just difficulty or stress. This showed me how small word choices change tone. Listening trained me to hear those choices and use them to express myself more naturally in English. Another story described overcoming nerves. A woman said I had butterflies in my stomach before a presentation, but I breathed deeply and focused until it went well. That phrase, butterflies in my stomach, expressed nervousness more vividly than I was nervous. Listening showed me such idioms give life to emotions and situations. I started practicing them in my own speech. Instead of saying I was nervous, I now say I had butterflies. And people instantly understand my feeling. Listening also revealed the role of humor in English. One man described being caught in rain, joking he looked like he caused the storm himself. That humor made the story unforgettable. It showed me how exaggeration, playfulness, and honesty make communication lighter and stronger at the same time. I began using humor in small ways. For example, if I made a mistake, I joked about it. That made people smile and feel closer to me. Another discovery was resilience. A podcast guest said I hit rock bottom after losing my job, but I decided to start fresh and rebuild my life. That phrase, hit rock bottom, became powerful for me. It wasn't only about failure, it was about honesty, courage, and the will to rise again stronger. Listening gave me the language to express both struggles and victories. It taught me to tell stories not just about what happened, but about emotions and growth. Another inspiring moment came from a businessman's success story. He said, I started with nothing, no money or connections, but I kept pushing and now run a company. The way he told it made me realize that determination is universal. Phrases like, I kept pushing forward inspired me to describe my own persistence too. Instead of saying I studied English, I now say, I kept pushing every day. That sounds more powerful. Reflecting effort and commitment in my journey, listening daily gave me these tools. I wasn't just memorizing vocabulary, I was learning how to sound natural, confident, and expressive like real English speakers. I realized that language is more than rules. It's about rhythm, tone, humor, culture, and emotion. Listening connects all these pieces into one living experience. That's why I believe listening is the most important habit for learners. It transforms not just your comprehension, but also your confidence and your voice. Real-life stories also help me practice vocabulary and sentence structures naturally. For example, in an interview, a man said, when I first moved abroad, I was nervous. He explained I wasn't sure if people would understand me, and I didn't want to make mistakes. But the more I spoke, the more confident I became. Soon, he realized mistakes were part of the process. In fact, he said some of his best conversations came directly from mistakes he had made. That story opened my eyes. It showed me language learning is a journey, and mistakes are essential. They create opportunities to learn and connect with others. Listening gave me phrases I could use. Instead of saying I'm bad at English, I now say I make mistakes, but I'm getting better every day. That sounds more hopeful and realistic. It encourages conversation because people see you're trying instead of focusing only on what you cannot do. Another story taught me about asking for help. In restaurants, people said, "Excuse me, could you explain this dish?" But with friends, they used, "Hey, can you help me?" Both mean the same, but tone and formality are different. Listening taught me how to adapt depending on situation, which made my English more natural. Another example came from someone talking about a vacation. They said I had the best time. I went to the beach every day, and it recharged me completely. This taught me how to share joy with detail. Instead of saying, I had fun, I now describe what I did and how it felt. Listening also made me realize that every story carries emotion. Even simple ones can inspire, if told with honesty, details, and feelings that draw the listener in. I remember hearing a podcast where someone said, I had a long day at work. Everything went wrong, and I was exhausted when I got home. That phrase, long day, painted a picture. It wasn't just about working, it was about stress, mistakes, and fatigue. One phrase carried layers of meaning. I started practicing the same. Instead of, I was tired, I'd say it was one of those days where everything piled up and left me drained. This small change made my speech more engaging. Listening taught me not only vocabulary, but also how to communicate feelings in a stronger, more human way. Another lesson came from storytelling. A friend said at first, I was terrible at cooking, burning everything. But later I improved and now make favorite dishes easily. That story wasn't just about food, it was about growth, persistence, and success. Listening showed me how to structure stories to inspire others with lessons learned. I realized stories are the heart of communication. People remember journeys more than facts. Listening daily trained me to tell my own stories in English clearly. Another podcast about travel described arriving in a busy city. The speaker said, I was overwhelmed at first, but after days, I discovered cafes and made new friends. That progression, from nervousness to comfort, made the story engaging. It taught me to share not only results, but also the process and feelings along the way. I practiced this by telling my own stories. Instead of saying I learned English, I say I felt lost at first, but step by step, I improved. This structure, beginning, struggle, progress, success, makes communication natural and meaningful. Listening exposed me to this flow again and again until it became automatic. Another important point was about transformation. One friend said I used to be shy, but now I'm confident. Thanks to experiences that pushed me beyond my comfort zone, that phrase used to be showed the past clearly, while now I'm showed the change. It's a simple but powerful way to describe personal growth in English. I began practicing it myself. Instead of I'm confident now, I say I used to avoid speaking, but now I can speak freely without fear. This makes my story relatable, inspiring others while showing progress. Listening daily trained me to notice these patterns and apply them in my own speech. One of the biggest obstacles in learning English is fear of mistakes. I used to feel nervous, but listening to real stories completely changed my mindset. A friend once said when I started learning English, I was terrified of mistakes. One day, I said I go to the store yesterday by accident. The listener smiled kindly and corrected me, saying, "You mean I went to the store yesterday?" At first, he was embarrassed, but then he realized something important. It wasn't the mistake that mattered. It was continuing the conversation and learning. That story taught me mistakes are part of growth, not signs of failure. I began telling people I'm still learning. Please be patient. Instead of feeling ashamed, I showed honesty, and people respected me more and encouraged me. That changed my confidence completely. I started practicing with native speakers, and I noticed people cared more about connection than about my grammar being perfect. Listening to such stories reminded me, language is about communication, not perfection. Mistakes are natural steps forward, each one building confidence and stronger understanding over time. Another lesson came from repetition. I listened to podcasts without subtitles many times, often rewinding the same sentence repeatedly. At first, it was frustrating, but helpful. Slowly, repetition trained my ears. Words and phrases became familiar, and I began recognizing patterns automatically. My brain was adjusting without me noticing progress daily. For example, I often heard phrases like, "I can't believe this," or "this is so crazy." At first confusing, but later they became second nature. Soon I was using them naturally in conversations. That's when I realized listening builds fluency through repetition. Just like music rhythms become familiar after hearing them often. Another story that inspired me came from a colleague. She said I had the most amazing vacation. I went to the beach every day and tried surfing. She added it was hard at first, but by the end of the week, I was catching waves. That story was full of emotion and growth. It wasn't just about the beach. It was about fear, challenge, and victory. Listening showed me how to describe experiences with emotions, not just plain actions. I started practicing the same. Instead of saying, "I traveled," I now say, "I felt nervous, but I tried new things and gained unforgettable experiences." This made my English richer and more inspiring. Listening also showed me that repetition isn't boring. Each repeat teaches tone, pronunciation, and emotion, not just meaning. Another powerful lesson came from storytelling itself. People don't just share facts, they share their journey, emotions, and lessons. That's what connects them with listeners and audiences. I once told my story of becoming a teacher. At first, I thought I couldn't do it, but volunteering gave me pride and confidence unexpectedly. That story wasn't about teaching rules. It was about overcoming fear and finding purpose. Listening had taught me how to turn experiences into meaningful, inspiring narratives. I realized English isn't only about vocabulary, it's about communication that touches people's hearts. Listening gave me endless examples of how to do exactly that. Another detail I noticed is how people emphasize emotions. Instead of saying, "Well, I was happy," they said I was over the moon, or "it made my day." Listening daily taught me to use these natural expressions. They made my English sound more authentic and colorful, reflecting not only meaning, but also the depth of feeling. That's why I believe listening is the foundation of language learning. It builds vocabulary, confidence, emotional expression, and connection all at the same time effortlessly. As I kept practicing, I noticed how listening every day shaped my brain. At first, everything sounded like noise, but gradually words became clear and familiar. It was like tuning a radio. At the beginning, all I heard was static, but suddenly voices and meanings appeared as if the channel locked in. One powerful moment came in a bookstore. I overheard two native speakers discussing Italy, and to my surprise, I understood almost everything without effort or translation. They talked about visiting the Colosseum, saying it had been on their bucket list for years. Thanks to listening practice, I immediately recognized that phrase with ease. Previously, I would have been lost, but in that moment, I realized my brain had been absorbing patterns all along. Progress was happening silently but steadily. That experience boosted my confidence. I realized listening every day is not only practice, it's training your ears until English becomes a natural background sound. Another discovery was contractions. Instead of "what are you doing?" many speakers said "what you doing?" It was faster but natural. Listening trained me to hear the difference. These small details made a huge impact. They helped me understand daily conversations, which are much faster and less clear than textbook sentences or language apps. Later, in a cafe, I tested myself. I ordered coffee and even chatted with the waiter. To my surprise, the words flowed without hesitation or translation. It was a short conversation, but it felt powerful. I was living the language. Listening had prepared me, and suddenly speaking became much easier for me. That's when I realized listening and speaking are inseparable. The more you listen, the more phrases become part of your memory, ready to be spoken naturally. This is why babies listen for months before they speak. Their brains collect rhythms and expressions until words eventually flow without conscious grammar or vocabulary effort. I began treating myself the same way. I listened daily without pressure, trusting my brain would store the language and make speaking easier over time. Later, I challenged myself with a full conversation in English with my friend Michael. Normally, I felt shy, but this time I trusted my listening experience. To my surprise, the conversation went well. We spoke about food, travel, and childhood stories. I even used expressions I had picked up unconsciously. Of course, I still made mistakes, but I didn't freeze. What mattered was confidence. Listening had given me courage to keep talking and stay relaxed throughout. That was the moment I truly understood. Listening isn't only about comprehension, it's about building courage, fluency, and emotional comfort to speak English confidently anywhere. Encouraged, I expanded my listening. I started exploring news reports, interviews, audiobooks, and even stand-up comedy, each one teaching me new styles, tones, and vocabulary. News taught me clarity and formality. Interviews taught me conversation rhythm. Audiobooks improved my pronunciation by repeating sentences aloud. Comedy gave me slang and humor. Comedy was hardest at first. I didn't get the jokes. But instead of giving up, I researched unknown words and contexts. Gradually, I started laughing naturally too. One day, I laughed at a punchline before subtitles appeared. That was an unforgettable moment. It proved I understood English in real time without needing support. This transformation filled me with pride. Listening wasn't just practice, it was changing my brain, my confidence, and my ability to live in the language. So my advice is simple: listen daily. Whether cooking, exercising, or commuting, surround yourself with English. Progress may feel invisible, but one day it will shine. One of the strongest proofs that listening worked came when I traveled to New York. It was my first time in an English-speaking country. I felt both excited and nervous. On the first day, I went to a small diner for breakfast. Unsure if I could handle a conversation, the waitress approached casually and said, "Hey there, how's it going? What can I get you?" Her words came quickly, naturally, without slowing for a learner, before practicing listening. I would have panicked, but this time I understood instantly, smiled, and replied naturally, "I'm good, thanks. I'll have pancakes and coffee, please." She nodded and asked, "Sure thing. You want syrup with that?" Again, I caught every word and responded, "Yes, please," without hesitation or fear in my voice. That short exchange was a turning point. It showed me that my hours of listening practice had prepared me for real-life conversations outside the classroom. It might sound simple, but for me, it was victory. I realized I wasn't just memorizing words anymore. I was living the English language fully. That's why if you ever feel frustrated, remember every time you listen, you're improving. Even if progress feels slow, one day everything will suddenly click. You'll realize you understand conversations naturally. Listening builds strength silently, and then unexpectedly, you'll see your progress shining through in a real situation. Of course, English can feel tricky. There are many rules, countless words, and so many accents. But the journey is worth it if you don't give up. I made listening my daily habit. At first, podcasts felt too fast, and I barely caught any words. I often rewound and replayed the same sentences. It was frustrating, but I reminded myself repetition is key. It's not about understanding everything at once. It's about constant exposure that trains your brain slowly. Gradually, my ears adjusted. Patterns became familiar. Sentences made sense. And I realized progress was happening even when it felt invisible in daily practice. For example, I listened to a podcast about Japan. The host described Tokyo, sushi, and culture at a fast pace. Yet I understood most of it. That was a breakthrough moment. It proved that daily listening builds comprehension steadily, even with new topics. Familiar patterns made everything clearer and easier to follow. I still remember the host talking about bowing in Japan as a greeting. That detail connected culture and language, teaching me something beyond vocabulary or grammar rules. As I listened more, I noticed cultural insights everywhere. They made me feel more connected not only to the language, but also to the people behind it. Listening didn't just improve my comprehension, it also changed my mindset. I stopped fearing mistakes and started appreciating tone, humor, and culture as part of learning. For example, I heard someone say, "I've got a lot on my plate today." At first, confusing. Later, I learned it simply meant being very busy. That's the kind of phrase textbooks rarely teach, but real speech makes clear. Listening showed me how words change meaning depending on context and tone completely. Another time, I listened to a finance podcast. The host said, "It's never too early to start saving. Trust me, your future self will thank you." I realized, "trust me" wasn't just literal, it was reassurance, making the listener feel comfortable. Listening revealed the emotional power of simple phrases used daily. This taught me English is flexible. The same words shift in meaning depending on context. Listening helps you recognize and use them correctly in real life. Another improvement I noticed was with movies and TV shows. In the beginning, I always needed subtitles. And even then, I struggled to keep up. But after months of consistent listening, something changed. I could follow plots and jokes without subtitles, even when I didn't know every single word spoken. That was a milestone. It showed me listening helps you focus on the big picture of communication, not just individual words or grammar rules. I realized natural speech has pauses, tone, and emphasis. For example, "Wow, that's amazing" can sound genuine or sarcastic depending on how it's spoken. Listening daily trained my ears to catch those differences. That made conversations clearer because I wasn't just hearing words, I was feeling emotions behind them. Accents also became easier. At first, Australian or British English confused me completely, but over time, listening often made those accents sound familiar and even enjoyable. Later, when I traveled to the UK, I wasn't nervous anymore. I had practiced through listening. So conversations with locals felt natural instead of intimidating. I remember sitting in a cafe in London, chatting about football and weather. I understood everything and replied naturally, which felt like true success for me. That's when I realized listening prepares you for real life. Every podcast, conversation, or movie I listened to became training for future interactions with people. Another big lesson came from descriptive language. A podcast host once described pancakes as steaming. With syrup dripping down the sides, I could imagine the scene instantly. That vivid image taught me how to describe experiences better. Instead of saying, I ate bread, I can say I enjoyed warm bread with melting butter. This detail makes stories richer and more engaging. Listening showed me how to bring language to life, so people feel part of your story when listening. Idioms also became clearer. Expressions like butterflies in my stomach or a lot on my plate confused me before, but listening in context revealed their real meaning. Soon, I started using them myself. People noticed and said my English sounded natural, almost native-like. That feedback motivated me to keep practicing with confidence. Listening also showed me every story carries emotions. Even simple routines can inspire if told with honesty and details. That's what makes storytelling powerful in English. I remember someone saying, I had a long day. Everything went wrong, and I was exhausted by evening. That phrase, long day, painted a complete picture. It wasn't just about work. It carried stress, fatigue, and frustration. Listening taught me how small expressions can communicate emotions more effectively than long explanations. I began practicing the same. Instead of saying I was tired, I'd say it was one of those days where everything piled up and drained me. This made my conversations more engaging. I realized English isn't about big words. It's about choosing the right ones that carry emotion and connect with people. Another lesson came from storytelling. A friend said at first I was terrible at cooking, burning everything. But later I improved and now I can cook easily. That story wasn't about cooking alone. It was about struggle, progress, and success. Listening showed me how to structure stories with challenges and achievements naturally. I started practicing this in English. Instead of saying I learned, I say I struggled first, but step by step, I improved. And now, I'm confident. This makes my language more human and relatable. Listening helped me see that progress itself is a story worth telling, not just the final results. Another powerful lesson came from stories about transformation. One friend said I used to be really shy, but now I'm confident after experiences pushed me outside my comfort zone. That phrase used to be contrasted with now I'm showed clear growth. Listening taught me how to describe change in English, not just present situations. I started practicing it myself. Instead of, I'm confident now, I say, I used to avoid speaking, but now I can speak freely without nervousness. This simple structure made my English sound stronger and more relatable. It allowed me to inspire others by showing growth, not just stating current abilities. Another lesson came from fear of mistakes. A friend once said when learning English, he said I go to the store yesterday, but was gently corrected. He realized mistakes didn't end conversations. They created learning moments. That story changed my thinking. Mistakes aren't failures. They're proof of progress and courage. I began telling people I'm still learning. Please be patient. People appreciated my honesty, and it built trust. Listening taught me courage matters more than perfection. Another important point was repetition. At first, I didn't understand podcasts without subtitles. I rewound repeatedly, but slowly my ears adjusted to rhythm and common patterns. One day I realized phrases like, "I can't believe this," or "that's crazy," became second nature. Listening repeatedly had trained my brain unconsciously and automatically. Another inspiring moment came from a colleague. She said I had an amazing vacation. I went to the beach daily and even tried surfing for the first time. She explained it was hard at first, but by the end, she was catching waves. That story was inspiring because it showed growth and persistence. I realized stories are most powerful when they include struggle, progress, and success. Listening helped me practice telling my own experiences with that same natural structure. Instead of saying, "I traveled," I now say I felt nervous at first. But step by step, I adjusted. And finally, I enjoyed the experience fully. This approach makes language vivid and human. Listening repeatedly showed me this pattern until it became automatic in the way I now share stories. Another podcast taught me about cultural phrases. I heard "trust me" often, and at first it seemed meaningless, but context showed it was reassurance, a friendly way of speaking. That small detail taught me how important tone is. Listening revealed the hidden emotional meaning behind simple words, which books alone could never fully explain. I also learned to recognize differences between formal and casual speech. For example, "start saving now" sounded casual, but "it's never too early" sounded more formal. Listening helped me choose words depending on the situation, making my English sound natural whether with friends, colleagues, or strangers. That confidence came only through practice. Another breakthrough came with accents. At first, Australian English confused me completely. Words blended together, and I couldn't separate them. But repeated listening slowly changed everything. Over time, my ears adjusted. I began recognizing patterns and rhythms. What once felt impossible started sounding natural, almost like hearing a familiar melody repeated often. Later, when I visited the UK, I wasn't nervous anymore. Thanks to constant listening, I could chat with locals in cafes naturally without hesitation or fear. One conversation about football and weather proved it. I followed every word and replied confidently. That moment confirmed listening had prepared me better than textbooks ever could. Another milestone came from descriptive language. A podcast host described pancakes as steaming, syrup dripping down the sides. That picture was so vivid, I could taste it. Listening taught me how to create similar descriptions in English. Instead of, "I ate bread," I'd say I enjoyed warm bread with melting butter in the morning. These details made my stories more engaging. People could imagine what I was saying, not just understand words. Listening helped me bring language alive with imagery. Idioms also became natural. Expressions like "butterflies in my stomach" or "a lot on my plate" confused me before. But context made their meanings clear eventually. Soon, I started using them myself. People said my English sounded natural, even native-like. Listening daily had taught me phrases that textbooks never fully explained to me. Another powerful story described a stressful work situation. The speaker said I had butterflies in my stomach before presenting, but I focused, and it went better than expected. That story showed me how to express fear and transformation. Instead of just, "I was nervous," I learned to describe the physical feeling and the outcome. I began practicing similar phrases in my own life. Instead of, "I'm nervous," I'd say, "I feel butterflies, but I'll focus and do my best." This sounded more human and positive. Listening gave me the courage to express emotions honestly while showing determination, which made my English richer and more inspiring. Another lesson came from humor. One speaker described being drenched in a rainstorm, joking He looked like he caused the rain himself. That exaggeration made listeners laugh. I realize humor doesn't require perfect grammar. It needs honesty and timing. Adding small jokes made my conversations more enjoyable and helped me connect with people better. Another inspiring story was about resilience. Man said, I hit rock bottom after losing my job, but I decided to start fresh and, step by step, improved. That phrase hit rock bottom stayed in my memory. It expressed despair vividly, yet carried hope. Listening taught me how to share struggles with courage and honesty. I started telling my own story using similar expressions. Instead of saying, I failed, I say I hit a low point, but I started fresh and kept going. This sounded stronger and gave people hope. Listening showed me English isn't just words. It's a way to express emotions, struggles, and growth in meaningful ways. Another inspiring moment came from a businessman's story. He said, I started with nothing, no money, no experience, but I had a dream and kept pushing. He explained that step by step. After many failures, he finally built a company with hundreds of employees. His words carried persistence, struggle, and incredible determination. Listening to that story taught me success isn't just about results, but about the process. Phrases like I kept pushing forward became part of my language. Instead of saying I studied English, I began saying I kept pushing every day. That sounded stronger, more alive, reflecting real persistence and determination behind learning. Listening also revealed how people talk about routines. A woman said, every morning I wake up at 6, make coffee, and run to clear my mind. That wasn't just describing actions, it was sharing values, discipline, and peace. Listening showed me how to describe my own habits in more natural, detailed ways. For example, instead of I wake up early, I'd say I wake up at 6, make tea, and read to start my day peacefully. Another podcast described stress. A man said I had a huge presentation. I was nervous, but I breathed deeply, focused, and it went better than expected. That story showed me how to shift from fear to confidence. Listening taught me to describe not just the challenge, but also the solution and outcome. I practiced by saying I was nervous, but decided to focus and push through. That sounded more hopeful and natural than only saying I was scared. Humor was another lesson. One speaker described being caught in a storm. Joking, he looked like he caused the rain himself. Everyone laughed at the exaggeration. That story showed me humor builds connection. I began using humor in English conversations, even with mistakes. People responded positively, and it made learning fun. Another story described a cooking disaster. A speaker said I burned breakfast but laughed and ate cereal instead. That resilience inspired me to handle mistakes with humor. Listening daily gave me countless examples of resilience, growth, and positivity. People didn't hide mistakes. They shared them openly, and that made their language engaging and human. I realized that's what English is really about. Not perfection, but communication filled with emotions, honesty, and connection. Listening was my path to discover that truth. Another valuable lesson was idioms. At first, phrases like on my bucket list or long day confused me, but hearing them in stories made them clear. Soon I was using them myself. People noticed my English sounded more natural, not like a textbook. Listening daily helped me absorb idioms until they felt natural. I also started recognizing formal versus casual tone. For example, start saving now is casual, while it's never too early to save sounds more formal and polite. Listening trained me to adapt depending on context. That skill gave me confidence to speak in any situation, whether with friends, at work, or with strangers. Another breakthrough came when I realized real conversations aren't perfect. People pause, repeat, and sometimes change ideas midway. Listening showed me that this is completely natural. Before, I always worried about speaking perfectly, but hearing native speakers hesitate and restart sentences helped me relax. I didn't need perfection. I needed communication. This gave me courage. I started speaking more freely, even with mistakes. The focus shifted from grammar to connection, which made conversations flow more naturally and easily. Another podcast taught me about descriptive emotion. A speaker said I felt my heart race before presenting, but I took a breath and everything went smoothly afterward. That description was more powerful than just I was nervous. Listening taught me to use imagery and details to express emotions in richer, more relatable ways. I started practicing phrases like my hands were shaking or I had butterflies in my stomach. These small expressions made my English more colorful and human. Another story described hitting rock bottom. The speaker said I had lost my job and relationships. But after reflection, I decided to start fresh and rebuild everything. That story touched me deeply. The phrase hit rock bottom showed despair vividly, while start fresh showed hope. Listening taught me to combine honesty with resilience. I began sharing my own struggles in the same way. Instead of I failed, I'd say I hit a low point, but I decided to keep going. That language inspired both me and others. Listening gave me courage to share not just victories, but also struggles, which made conversations real and relatable. Another inspiring moment came from humor. One podcast host joked about forgetting his jokes on stage, but still making people laugh. The humor was in his honesty. That story taught me humor doesn't need perfection. It needs authenticity. I started laughing at my own mistakes and found people responded positively, even encouraging me. Listening also showed me how to add energy to conversations. Instead of saying, "That's nice," people said, "No way," "That's incredible," or "I can't believe it." These reactions showed real excitement. I copied them in my own speech. And suddenly, conversations felt more alive, filled with emotion and stronger connection. Another discovery was about cultural phrases. In the US, people often say, "Have a nice day" casually. Listening helped me realize it's not deep. It's friendly habit. That taught me culture and language go hand in hand. Understanding phrases in context made my English smoother, because I wasn't confused by casual expressions anymore. Another podcast about business used phrases like bull market and bear market, at first confusing, but after research and listening again, I understood perfectly and felt progress. That experience reminded me not to give up when words are new. Listening again with context turns confusion into clarity, step by step, every single time. Another lesson came from storytelling about culture. A podcast host said when I moved abroad, I missed small things like the smell of fresh bread each morning. That detail made me feel nostalgic, even though it wasn't my story. Listening showed me how language connects not only words, but also emotions and memories. I realized communication is stronger when you share feelings, not just facts. Instead of, "I missed home," you can say, "I missed the smell of bread." Those small details bring stories alive. They give listeners images and emotions they can connect with, making your language more meaningful, vivid, and unforgettable. Another powerful moment was hearing someone say I had butterflies in my stomach before a presentation, but I took a deep breath and did my best. That phrase painted a clear picture of nervousness. It showed me idioms and imagery express emotions more effectively than plain sentences like "I was nervous" ever could. I started practicing this. Instead of saying "I'm nervous," I said "I've got butterflies, but I'll push through." It sounded more natural and also more courageous. Listening also taught me resilience. A speaker said I studied hard but failed. I was devastated. Yet I asked for help and passed the next test. That story reminded me failure isn't the end. it's a step in learning. Listening gave me language to describe challenges positively instead of sounding hopeless or negative. I practiced saying I didn't do as well as I hoped, but I learned and improved. This made me sound stronger and more optimistic overall. Another great lesson came from humor. A speaker described being drenched by rain, joking he looked like he caused the storm. That exaggeration made everyone laugh. I realized humor makes communication human. It's not about perfect grammar, but about playfulness and honesty. Listening taught me how to add humor naturally in English. Another inspiring story describes success after hardship. A businessman said, "I started with nothing, no money or experience, but I kept pushing and now run a company." That phrase, "I kept pushing forward," inspired me deeply. Listening taught me persistence is powerful, and English has natural ways to express effort and resilience clearly. I began using similar phrases. Instead of "I studied English," I say "I kept pushing every day." It reflects commitment and makes my story more inspiring. Listening daily gave me these tools: vocabulary, idioms, humor, resilience, all entered my language naturally. I wasn't memorizing anymore. I was absorbing the living language. Another discovery was about tone in one podcast. Someone said "really" with excitement, meaning curiosity. Another said "really" with flat tone, meaning disbelief. Same word, different meaning. That showed me listening isn't just hearing words, it's hearing emotions behind them. Tone changes everything, and listening trains your ears to understand those hidden messages. This made my English stronger. I started adjusting my own tone, making sure my voice matched my feelings. So my communication became clearer and more authentic. Another lesson I learned through listening was how important context is. Words don't stand alone. Their meaning changes depending on the situation and tone of voice. For example, in one podcast, a man said I had to handle many meetings today. The word "handle" suggested not only work, but also responsibility and confidence. Listening helped me understand that handle wasn't just manage. It carried a feeling of control. That nuance made my English more precise and natural in conversations. Another example came from idioms. I often heard people say, "I've got a lot on my plate." At first confusing. Later, I realized it simply meant being busy. Hearing it many times in context made it clear. Soon, I began using it myself naturally. Listening showed me idioms can't be learned in isolation. They must be heard in real conversations. That's how you understand their tone, when to use them, and how they make your speech more authentic and alive. Another inspiring story was about passion. A photographer said, "Every weekend, I walk around the city for hours, taking photos. I don't care if people think I'm strange." That story showed me how passion gives energy to language. Instead of saying, "I like something," you can describe actions and feelings, making it vivid and powerful. I practice by saying I spend hours reading books until midnight because I can't stop. Listening taught me to express hobbies with energy, not just flat statements. Another breakthrough came when I realized listening also teaches culture. In American podcasts, people often said, "Have a nice day," something I once found strange but now understood. It wasn't deep, just politeness. Listening revealed these habits, preparing me for real conversations where such phrases appear naturally in daily life interactions everywhere. Another podcast taught me about humor. A comedian said, "I forgot my jokes on stage but still made people laugh." The humor came from his honesty, not words. That story taught me communication is not about perfection. It's about authenticity. Listening reminded me that even mistakes can make conversations warmer and more engaging naturally. I started doing the same. When I made errors, I laughed and kept going. People appreciated my confidence. Listening helped me build that attitude step by step. Another moving story described resilience. A man said I hit rock bottom, but after reflection, I decided to start fresh. His story carried both pain and hope. That phrase, hit rock bottom, became part of my vocabulary. It expressed despair vividly, but combined with start fresh, it created a message of courage and renewal. I started sharing my own struggles in the same way. Instead of I failed, I said I hit a low point, but I started again stronger. This language inspired me and my listeners. Listening daily gave me both vocabulary and courage to tell my life story in English with honesty and strength. Another useful lesson from listening was about everyday routines. One woman said every morning, I wake up at 6, make coffee, and go for a run. At first it sounded simple, but I realized it was more than actions. It showed discipline, habits, and how she set her priorities each day. Listening taught me that describing routines this way makes conversations richer. Instead of I wake up early, I could say I wake up and run daily. Adding details like making coffee or clearing my mind makes the listener imagine my morning, making my English more engaging and meaningful to others. Another story described nerves before a big presentation. The speaker said I had butterflies in my stomach, but I took a deep breath and did well. That image of butterflies was more powerful than simply saying I was nervous. Listening showed me idioms make English expressive, colorful, and emotionally real for listeners. I began practicing by saying, I've got butterflies, but I'll push through. It made my English sound natural and gave me courage at the same time. Another inspiring story came from failure. A man said I studied hard, failed the exam, but instead of quitting, I asked for help and tried again. That story reminded me setbacks are normal. The phrase, instead of quitting, I asked for help, became my model. Listening gave me positive language for challenges. I started practicing phrases like I didn't do as well as I hoped, but I figured out mistakes and improved. It sounded stronger and more resilient. Another podcast made me laugh. A speaker said I was drenched in rain, looking like I caused the storm myself. That exaggeration made the story unforgettable. It showed me humor adds connection. Even small jokes make conversations lively. Listening taught me that humor doesn't need perfect grammar. It needs honesty and creativity instead. I began using humor myself. If I spilled coffee, I'd joke I was testing gravity. Listening gave me courage to use humor in English comfortably. Another lesson came from cultural phrases. In American podcasts, people often said, trust me or have a nice day. Listening taught me their tone and meaning. Trust me wasn't literal. It reassured the listener. Have a nice day wasn't deep. It was polite and friendly. Context explained them better than dictionaries ever could. Listening helped me adapt my English for different situations. With friends, I spoke casually. With colleagues, I used formal tone. That flexibility came only through practice. Another inspiring story was about success. A businessman said, I started with nothing, no money, no connections, but I kept pushing, and now I run a company. The phrase I kept pushing forward became powerful for me. Listening taught me persistence is universal, and English has natural ways to express it simply but strongly. I began saying I kept pushing every day when I described learning English. It sounded confident, showing my commitment to the journey without fear or hesitation. Another valuable lesson I discovered was that stories are more powerful than facts. People remember emotions, struggles, and victories more than grammar rules or vocabulary lists. For example, one podcast guest shared how she learned to cook. She said at first I was terrible, burning everything, but over time I improved gradually. Her story wasn't about recipes, it was about persistence. That made it engaging. Listening taught me that English is strongest when you tell journeys, not just results. I began practicing storytelling. Instead of saying I learned English, I'd say I struggled at first, felt frustrated, but slowly I gained confidence and began improving. That structure, beginning, struggle, progress, success, made my English more natural. People related to my story because they could feel my emotions, not just hear information. Another story came from traveling. A man said when I first arrived in a busy city, I was overwhelmed, but after days, I found cafes and made friends. That shift from nervous to comfortable made the story engaging. Listening showed me every experience becomes powerful when you include emotions and transformation, not just plain facts. I started telling my own experiences that way. Instead of saying I traveled, I'd say I was lost at first. But step by step, I adjusted confidently. That change made my stories interesting and relatable. Listening gave me countless examples of this storytelling pattern until it became natural for me to use. Another powerful phrase I learned was used to be, one speaker said I used to be shy, but now I'm confident thanks to difficult but meaningful experiences. That contrast between past and present expressed growth beautifully. I began practicing it myself by saying, I used to avoid speaking, but now I feel comfortable. This language didn't just show my skills, it showed my progress. Listening daily trained me to notice and adopt expressions that carry depth and relatability in conversations. Another important lesson was about mistakes. A friend once said I told someone I go to the store yesterday, but they kindly corrected me without judgment. That moment showed him mistakes weren't the end of communication. They were steps toward growth. Listening to his story reminded me mistakes are proof of learning. I stopped fearing mistakes and started embracing them. I told people I'm still learning. Please be patient. That honesty built trust and encouraged natural conversations with others. Listening also taught me that repetition is not boring, it's powerful. Replaying sentences helped me absorb rhythms and idioms until they became automatic in my own speech. One day, I heard the phrase, I can't believe this is happening. I had heard it many times before, but suddenly, I used it naturally myself. That moment proved listening builds fluency silently. Your brain collects patterns, and one day, they simply appear in your speech without conscious effort or memorization at all. Another inspiring story came from a colleague who described her vacation. She said, I had the most amazing time, going to the beach every day, trying surfing. At first it was difficult, she admitted, but by the end of the week she was catching waves. That transformation made the story vivid and memorable. Listening to her reminded me stories are strongest when they include challenge, growth, and success. Simple facts can't inspire the way a journey with emotions always can. I began telling my own experiences in the same way. Instead of I traveled, I'd say I was nervous at first, but soon discovered joy. That shift made my English more engaging and relatable. Listening gave me a natural blueprint for storytelling, where struggles and victories are both part of the message. Another breakthrough came with repetition. I listened to podcasts many times, even rewinding sentences I didn't understand. Slowly, my ears adjusted, and patterns became familiar. Over time, I realized I no longer needed to translate. My brain began understanding meaning directly from sound, tone, and context without stopping to analyze each word. For example, I often heard phrases like, "This is so crazy," or "I can't believe it." At first confusing. Later, they became automatic in my memory. One day, I used them in my own conversation naturally. That was proof listening wasn't passive. It was training my brain to store and use real English. Another important moment came when I realized culture and language are connected. In podcasts, Americans often said, "Have a nice day." At first, I thought it strange. Later, I understood it was just politeness, not deep emotion. Listening showed me cultural habits behind phrases, helping me avoid confusion and speak more naturally myself. Another podcast taught me about finance. The speaker said, "It's never too early to start saving. Trust me." That phrase, trust me, carried warmth and reassurance. Listening taught me phrases often carry emotional weight beyond their literal meaning. It's not just words, it's tone, mood, and connection that make language alive. I began practicing by using similar phrases myself. For example, instead of just giving advice, I'd add, trust me. It made my English sound friendlier and warmer. Another big lesson was humor. One podcast host joked about forgetting his lines on stage, but still making people laugh. The humor came from honesty, not perfection. That story taught me laughter builds connection faster than perfect grammar ever could. Listening inspired me to use small jokes in English, even with mistakes included. I discovered people enjoy conversations more when you're real, relaxed. Listening gave me courage to add humor and personality, not just correctness, into my English speaking. Another powerful story I remember was about resilience. A man said I hit rock bottom after losing my job, but I decided to start fresh again. That phrase, hit rock bottom, captured despair so clearly. Combined with start fresh, it created a story of hope, determination, and renewal that inspired me deeply. Listening to him showed me English isn't only about vocabulary, it's about expressing human experiences, struggles, and victories in ways that connect with listeners emotionally and meaningfully. I began practicing this in my own stories. Instead of I failed, I said I hit a low point, but I decided to keep going. That language sounded stronger and more human. Listening gave me courage to share struggles honestly while still showing resilience, which made my English more relatable to others. Another breakthrough came when I realized tone changes meaning. For example, the word really can sound curious, excited, or sarcastic, depending entirely on how someone says it. Listening daily trained my ears to catch these hidden layers. Suddenly, I could understand emotions behind words, not just dictionary meanings, which made conversations clearer and easier. I started paying attention to my own tone too. Instead of speaking flatly, I matched my voice to emotions, making my communication more authentic and engaging overall. Another lesson came from idioms. At first, phrases like on my bucket list or long day confused me, but context and repetition made their meanings clear over time. Soon, I used them naturally. Saying visiting Rome is on my bucket list sounded much more authentic than just, I want to go to Rome someday. Listening also revealed how real conversations flow. People interrupt, laugh, and use fillers like you know or I mean. At first, distracting. Later, I saw they're natural. I started using fillers myself carefully. Instead of speaking too formally, I'd add you know in casual speech. It made my English sound friendlier and less rigid. Another podcast taught me about descriptive storytelling. A host said we sat down to steaming pancakes with maple syrup dripping. That vivid image made me imagine the scene. I began practicing similar details. Instead of, I had breakfast, I'd say I enjoyed hot coffee with fresh bread while the morning sun filled the room. These small details made my English richer. Listening showed me it's not about big words, but about painting pictures with language that captures feeling and atmosphere. Another lesson was about routines. A woman said every morning I wake up, run, and clear my mind. Listening taught me routines reveal personality, not just actions. Instead of I wake up early, I now describe my mornings with detail. That makes conversations more engaging and helps listeners connect with me personally. Another valuable story I heard was about stress at work. The speaker said I had a huge presentation. I was nervous, but I breathed deeply and focused. He added, it went better than expected. That story showed me how to express nervousness, action, and outcome together. Listening gave me natural patterns to copy. I began practicing by saying I was nervous, but I took a breath and pushed through. That sounded both real and optimistic, not flat or negative. Another inspiring story came from humor. A podcast host said, I was drenched in rain, looking like I caused the storm myself. That exaggeration made people laugh. I realized humor makes stories memorable. Listening taught me that laughter is part of communication, and even mistakes or difficulties can be turned into jokes easily. I started adding humor myself. If I spilled coffee, I joked I was testing gravity today. People laughed, and the conversation felt warm and relaxed immediately. Another breakthrough came from cultural understanding in American podcasts. People often ended conversations with, "Have a nice day." At first, I thought it meaningless, but later understood. It was politeness, a friendly habit, not deep emotion. Listening revealed these cultural habits, preparing me for real conversations where such phrases naturally appear often. Another podcast about finance taught me the phrase, "Trust me." At first, I thought it literal, but I realized it was reassurance, making the listener feel comfortable. Listening taught me words carry emotion beyond their dictionary meaning. That changed the way I listen and the way I speak, adding warmth and friendliness. I began using phrases like trust me when giving advice. It made my English sound more authentic and closer to natural speech, not robotic or overly formal. Another story describes success after failure. A businessman said I started with nothing, no money or experience, but I kept pushing forward, and now I run a company. That phrase, "I kept pushing forward," stayed with me. Listening showed me persistence is powerful, and English has natural ways to express resilience in simple words. I began saying I kept pushing every day when I described learning English. That sounded stronger than I studied, because it reflected commitment and determination. Another lesson came from noticing that real conversations aren't perfect. People pause, restart, or change subjects. Listening taught me that fluency doesn't mean speaking without mistakes. Fluency means keeping the conversation alive. I stopped worrying about perfect grammar. Instead, I focused on staying engaged. That shift made my English flow naturally with others. Another podcast gave me insight into emotions. The host said I was really nervous before speaking, but instead of letting fear control me, I focused and succeeded. That shift in language, from fear to determination, was powerful. Listening taught me to describe emotions honestly, but also to show how I responded and overcame them. I practiced by saying, I was nervous, but I decided to do my best. That sounded positive, proving that emotions and actions together create stronger communication. Another story I remember was about failure. A student said, I studied hard but failed. I was devastated. Yet, I asked for help and improved next time. That story inspired me. The phrase "I was devastated" but showed me how to express vulnerability while also showing resilience. A balance that makes speech authentic. I began describing my own experiences the same way. Instead of "I failed," I'd say I was devastated, but I figured out mistakes and kept improving daily. This made my English more human. Listening showed me language isn't just about reporting facts, it's about sharing emotions, setbacks, and progress in ways others can connect with. Another great moment came when I realized humor is universal. A podcast host said I burned my breakfast, so I laughed and ate cereal instead. That story taught me mistakes can be funny. Listening inspired me to laugh at my own errors in English, which made conversations lighter and less stressful. I started joking about small failures. If I forgot a word, I'd laugh and say my brain went on vacation. People smiled, and the talk continued. Another discovery was the importance of descriptive detail. A podcast host said we sat down to steaming plates of pancakes with syrup dripping down the sides. That vivid language painted a clear picture. Listening daily taught me to add details when speaking. Instead of "I ate," I'd describe taste, smell, and feeling. These details made my speech richer and more engaging. People didn't just hear my story, they imagined it, almost living the experience through my description of events. Another breakthrough came with idioms. Expressions like butterflies in my stomach or long day once confused me, but context made them clear, and repetition fixed them in memory. Soon, I was using them naturally. Saying I had butterflies before speaking sounded more authentic than just I was nervous. Listening taught me when to use idioms. Another inspiring lesson came from cultural habits. Americans often said, "Have a nice day." Listening helped me realize it was a polite, friendly custom, not deep sentiment. That understanding prepared me for real interactions. When people said it, I responded naturally instead of feeling confused. Listening connected language with culture in daily life. Another lesson came from hearing about cultural differences. A podcast host said when I moved abroad, I felt out of place, but people helped me feel comfortable. That story taught me language isn't just about vocabulary. It's about expressing feelings of loneliness, kindness, and gratitude. Listening gave me the words to describe such experiences. I began practicing by saying I felt out of place at first, but later I became comfortable. That language showed transformation, not just a simple state. Another valuable moment came from financial podcasts. The host often said, "It's never too early to start saving." Trust me. That phrase added warmth, reassurance, and friendliness. Listening taught me those small phrases build connection. I started using them myself when encouraging a friend. I'd say, "Keep going, trust me, it will get easier." That made my English sound natural, filled with emotion. Listening revealed English is more than grammar. It's about tone, mood, and attitude that give meaning to simple words. Another inspiring story came from resilience. A businessman said I started with nothing, no experience, no connections, but I had a dream and I kept pushing forward. His story taught me persistence matters more than circumstances. The phrase "I kept pushing forward" inspired me to describe my own journey of learning English every day. I began saying, "I kept pushing daily," instead of just "I studied." That expression carried strength, showing my commitment and determination to continue learning no matter what. Another breakthrough was realizing that real conversations aren't perfect. People pause, laugh, and sometimes restart. Listening taught me fluency means flow, not flawless grammar or vocabulary. That realization freed me from fear. I focused on keeping conversations alive. Listening gave me countless examples of imperfect but natural communication that still connected people deeply. Another podcast highlighted humor. The speaker said, "I forgot my jokes on stage but still made the audience laugh by being myself." That honesty made it funny. I learned humor doesn't require perfect words. It requires authenticity. Listening encouraged me to laugh at my mistakes, making conversations lighter and more human in English. I started using humor intentionally. If I stumbled, I'd smile and say my English is still warming up. People laughed, and the tension disappeared immediately. Another moment came when I realized descriptive details make stories memorable. A host described coffee steam rising in the morning sun, and I could almost smell it. That image reminded me to add details to my speech. Instead of, "I had coffee," I'd say I enjoyed hot coffee while sunlight filled the room. Such language makes listeners imagine my experience. Listening daily trained me to notice and practice this skill, making my English more colorful, real, and emotionally engaging overall. Another important lesson came from resilience after failure. A student said that I studied hard, failed, felt devastated, but instead of quitting, I asked for help and improved. That story taught me language for expressing vulnerability and strength together. Listening gave me phrases like "I was devastated, but" which balance honesty with hope beautifully. I started practicing similar expressions. Instead of I failed, I'd say I was devastated, but I learned and tried again. It sounded stronger and more encouraging to others. Another inspiring podcast described stress before a presentation. The speaker said, I felt butterflies in my stomach, but I breathed deeply, focused, and delivered my talk successfully. That idiom, butterflies in my stomach, became part of my speech. It made my English sound colorful, far more natural than just I was nervous before speaking. Listening daily showed me how idioms carry imagery that textbooks rarely teach. They add life to language, making conversations sound authentic, real, and emotionally connected to listeners. Another valuable story came from humor. A host described being caught in a storm, joking he looked like he caused the rain himself. Everyone laughed at his exaggeration. That moment reminded me humor makes mistakes lighter. Listening taught me jokes don't need perfection. They need honesty. Adding humor makes English conversations warm and memorable. I practice by saying if I forgot a word, my brain is on holiday. People laughed, and the conversation continued naturally. Listening gave me that courage. Another breakthrough came with cultural understanding. In American podcasts, I often heard, have a nice day. Listening revealed it was politeness, not deep emotion, just cultural habit. That realization helped me in real conversations. When people said it, I responded naturally, without confusion. Listening connected language with culture, preparing me for everyday interactions. Another podcast taught me about business terms. At first, bull market and bear market confused me, but after research and re-listening, I understood perfectly and felt proud. That experience reminded me, listening plus context builds understanding, even when new vocabulary feels impossible. Repeated listening makes meaning clear over time, turning confusion into clarity slowly. Another discovery came from descriptive language. A speaker said we sat down to steaming pancakes with maple syrup dripping down the sides. That vivid image stayed with me. It inspired me to describe experiences more richly. Instead of, I had breakfast, I'd say I enjoyed hot coffee with fresh bread as sunlight filled the room. Listening taught me language isn't about big words. It's about details that create pictures. Those details make English more memorable and help people feel connected to your story. Another lesson I learned was that listening daily builds subconscious fluency. At first, everything sounded fast, but slowly my ears adjusted, and meaning came naturally. It felt like tuning a radio. At the beginning, all I heard was noise. Then suddenly words and sentences became clear without me even realizing progress. One day in a bookstore, I overheard two people talking about Italy. To my surprise, I understood almost everything, even idioms, without needing translation or subtitles. That moment proved my listening practice was working. My brain had been silently collecting patterns. When the right time came, everything clicked, and I felt confident. Another breakthrough came from contractions. Instead of, what are you doing? People said, what you doing? At first, I couldn't recognize it, but repeated listening trained my ears. Soon, I began using contractions myself, saying, I'm instead of I am or gonna instead of going to made my English sound more natural and less formal. Listening also showed me how people link words together. Phrases like, what do you mean often sounded like what do you mean? Understanding this helped me follow conversations easily. Another valuable discovery was the power of repetition. Hearing the same idioms and expressions repeatedly, like I can't believe this or that's crazy, made them automatic in my mind. Soon, I was using them naturally in conversations. That was proof listening isn't passive, it's active brain training, turning repeated sounds into usable language without memorization. Another lesson came from humor. A podcast host joked about forgetting lines on stage but still making people laugh. His honesty made the story funny and engaging. I realized humor doesn't require perfect grammar, it needs personality. Listening encouraged me to laugh at my mistakes, making conversations more relaxed and building connections with people. I started practicing this myself. If I made an error, I smiled and said, "My English is still warming up." People laughed, and conversations flowed naturally. Another podcast described passion. A photographer said, "Every weekend, I walk around the city taking pictures for hours. I don't care if people think I'm strange." That story taught me to express passion in English by describing actions. Instead of saying I like reading, I'd say I spend hours reading late into the night. This sounded more vivid and authentic. Listening daily trained me to notice how people use details and emotions, not just words, to express what matters deeply. Another important realization was that real conversations aren't perfect. People hesitate, restart, and use fillers like you know. Listening showed me that fluency doesn't mean perfection at all. It means keeping the conversation alive. That understanding gave me courage to speak freely without worrying too much about grammar mistakes. I focused on communication instead. Another story that inspired me was about transformation. A speaker said, "I used to be shy, but now I'm confident after experiences pushed me outside my comfort zone." That contrast between used to be and now I'm showed growth beautifully. Listening daily taught me how to describe my own changes in English more effectively. I practiced by saying, "I used to avoid speaking, but now I can talk freely." That expression made my English stronger and more inspiring for others. Another podcast showed me resilience through failure. A man said I studied hard, failed the exam, but instead of quitting, I asked for help and succeeded later. That structure, failure, decision, victory, was powerful. Listening gave me a model for describing my own setbacks in ways that encouraged hope instead of only expressing disappointment. I started saying, "I didn't do as well as I hoped, but I figured out mistakes and improved." That phrasing sounded more natural and positive. Another lesson came from cultural habits. In American podcasts, I often heard "have a nice day" or "trust me." At first confusing, but context revealed their meaning. Trust me meant reassurance, not literal trust. Have a nice day was polite habit, not deep emotion. Listening showed me how culture shapes everyday expressions in English. I began practicing by using those phrases myself. It made my speech sound friendlier and closer to natural conversation instead of stiff textbook English without real feeling. Another story I remember came from humor. A host said I was drenched in rain, looking like I caused the storm. That exaggeration made listeners laugh instantly. I realized humor makes communication human. Listening taught me that even small jokes make conversations more enjoyable, helping people connect faster regardless of grammar or vocabulary mistakes. I started joking in English too. If I forgot a word, I'd say my brain is still on vacation. People laughed, and the talk continued naturally. Another discovery was about descriptive storytelling. A podcast host said we sat down to steaming plates of pancakes with syrup dripping down the sides. That image stayed with me. It reminded me that details matter. Instead of saying, "I ate breakfast," I could describe hot coffee, fresh bread, and sunlight. Listening gave me countless examples to copy. These descriptions made my English more engaging. People could imagine the scene, not just understand words. Listening taught me that vivid details create connection and lasting memory. Another powerful moment came when I realized fluency doesn't mean perfect grammar. It means keeping conversations alive, even with pauses. Mistakes, or fillers like listening to real conversations showed me this clearly. People often restart sentences or change direction mid-thought. Yet, Communication continues smoothly without anyone feeling uncomfortable at all. That discovery gave me courage. I stopped chasing perfection and started focusing on connection. My English became more natural, and conversations flowed without unnecessary pressure anymore. Another valuable lesson came from idioms. A podcast speaker said, I had butterflies in my stomach before presenting, but after breathing deeply, I spoke clearly and confidently afterward. That phrase, butterflies in my stomach, carried imagery that textbooks can't provide. Listening taught me how idioms capture emotions vividly, making English colorful, relatable, and alive. I practiced by saying, I've got butterflies, but I'll push through. That sounded much more authentic than I'm nervous, because it showed determination as well as honesty. Another breakthrough came from repetition. At first, podcasts felt impossible, but replaying the same sentences trained my ears. Gradually, phrases like, I can't believe it, became automatic. Soon, I found myself using them in my own speech without effort. Listening had transferred them from sound to memory, turning practice into real fluency naturally. Another inspiring story described resilience. A businessman said, I started with nothing, no money, no experience, no connections, but I had a dream, and I kept pushing forward. His words inspired me deeply. The phrase I kept pushing forward became my model for describing my English journey, showing persistence, effort, and daily progress together. I began saying I kept pushing every day when learning English. That sounded stronger than I studied, because it revealed determination and a sense of ongoing struggle. Another lesson came from humor. A podcast host said, I forgot my jokes on stage but still made the audience laugh. The humor came from honesty itself. That story reminded me, communication is about authenticity, not perfection. I began laughing at my own mistakes, which made conversations lighter and less stressful for everyone. I even created small jokes. If I mispronounced a word, I'd say my tongue is exercising today. People laughed, and the talk continued naturally without tension. Another valuable story was about cultural understanding. In American podcasts, people often ended conversations with, have a nice day. Listening showed me it was simply polite custom. At first, I thought it was meaningless, but later I realized it was friendliness. That awareness helped me respond naturally in real conversations without confusion or hesitation. Another discovery from listening was about descriptive emotion. A speaker said I felt my heart race before a meeting, but I stayed calm and delivered my message. That phrase, my heart race, painted a clear picture of nervousness. Listening showed me these expressions are stronger than simply saying, I was nervous before speaking. I practiced by saying, I felt my heart race, but I kept going. That language captured both my fear and my determination, making my story richer. Another valuable story came from failure. A student said, I studied hard, failed, felt devastated, but instead of quitting, I asked for help and passed later. That story taught me failure can be reframed. The phrase, instead of quitting, I asked for help, became my model for resilience. Sounding natural and strong, I began saying I didn't do as well as I hoped, but I learned and improved. That phrasing inspired me and gave listeners encouragement as well. Another podcast highlighted humor. A host said I was drenched in rain, looking like I caused the storm myself. Everyone laughed because the exaggeration was so relatable. I realized humor is powerful. Listening encouraged me to laugh at my mistakes in English, which made me sound more human and relaxed in conversations everywhere. I started practicing humor myself. If I forgot a word, I'd say my brain is on vacation today. People laughed, and the talk continued smoothly. Another breakthrough was noticing how real conversations flow. People use fillers like you know or I mean, and they interrupt each other without destroying the conversation at all. At first, these details confused me, But later, I saw they were part of natural speech. Listening daily trained me to accept them and keep following. I began using fillers myself carefully. Instead of sounding robotic, I sounded casual and relaxed. That made my English closer to native speech, authentic and easy. Another lesson came from descriptive storytelling. A host said we sat down to steaming pancakes with syrup dripping down the sides. That image stayed in my memory. It inspired me to add detail when speaking. Instead of saying, I had coffee, I'd say I enjoyed hot coffee as sunlight warmed the kitchen. These descriptions made my English vivid. Listening taught me it's not about complicated words, but about details that create pictures and emotions for your listeners to feel. Another cultural phrase I learned through listening was, have a nice day. At first strange. Later, I understood it's simply politeness, showing friendliness, not deep sentiment at all. That realization helped me in real conversations. I could respond naturally with thank you. You too. Without overthinking. Listening prepared me for real-life situations everywhere. Another lesson I learned was that repetition creates fluency. At first, I rewound podcasts many times. But slowly, I began understanding without stopping. Even when speech was fast, that process showed me listening isn't passive, it's active brain training. My ears collected patterns, and over time, those patterns became part of my natural communication. I noticed this most when watching TV shows. At first, I needed subtitles, but after months of listening daily, I understood jokes and conversations without reading at all. That breakthrough proved listening every day truly works. It shifts your brain from translating into simply understanding. That's how children learn, and adults can too. Another inspiring story came from a comedian. He said I forgot my jokes on stage. But people laughed anyway because I was honest and kept speaking naturally. That story reminded me fluency isn't about perfection. It's about connection. Listening helped me see communication succeeds when you're authentic, not when you avoid every single mistake. I started applying this in my own conversations. If I stumbled, I smiled and continued. People cared more about the message than about minor errors I made. Another discovery was about idioms. Phrases like, I've got a lot on my plate once confused me, but listening in context revealed they simply mean being very busy. Soon, I was using them naturally. Saying, I've got a lot on my plate sounded more authentic than just I'm busy. Listening gave me real-life vocabulary to use. Another lesson was about expressing growth. A speaker said, I used to be shy, but now I'm confident. That contrast showed change beautifully, inspiring me to do the same. I practiced by saying, I used to avoid speaking, but now I can join conversations. That simple expression showed my journey and encouraged others at the same time. Listening also taught me storytelling is essential. People don't remember grammar rules. They remember stories with feelings, challenges, and victories. That's why listening to real stories was powerful. I began structuring my own stories with beginning, struggle, progress, and success. That made my English more natural, engaging, and human, connecting better with everyone who listened. Another valuable point was patience. Progress felt slow at first, but listening daily changed everything. One day, suddenly, I realized I was understanding conversations without translating anymore. That moment proved patience pays off. Language learning isn't a race, it's a journey. Listening every day moves you forward, even if progress feels invisible at times. Finally, I realized listening isn't just about English. It's about connecting with people, culture, and emotions. Every story gave me language, but also wisdom and inspiration. So my advice is simple. Listen daily. Podcasts, conversations, movies, anything real. Over time, you'll notice patterns, gain confidence, and speak naturally. Trust me, it truly works.